Well, hello, dear comrades, and welcome to a new episode in our close readings of Naturalism and Religion by Graham Oppy. Last week we went through the introduction, what the book is about, and the plan of the book. And we also read brief definitions of key words like naturalism, religion, big pictures, but we didn't go in detail. And this is what the remaining chapters will be about. And so today we read the second chapter, What is Naturalism, which is actually the first chapter of the book if you don't count the introduction as a chapter. So without further ado, let's jump in. So what is naturalism? So when we ask questions like that, like what is X, what we are asking is what is the characterization of X? And by characterization, we mean what identifies X. Like Oppy, I'm also a naturalist, but what makes me a naturalist? What can allow others to identify me as a naturalist? So there are criteria that I must have so that we can all agree Ismail and Oppy are naturalists. And so this first chapter sets out to lay down those criteria. How do we identify naturalism and naturalists? Well, through those characterizations. But depending on those characterizations, people can have different views, different opinions, or even attitudes towards naturalists. And even among naturalists, there are many disagreements regarding those characterizations. Like not all naturalists agree on what naturalism is or what makes someone a naturalist. And quite often, naturalism's critiques like we've seen in the introduction with the entry from Conservapedia, critiques of naturalism, they tend to add characterizations to naturalism that actually don't belong to naturalism, and in fact they only end up abusing the term. And sure, you can say that there are those who take the term as a badge of honor, like Oppy says. Here you can think of some of the new atheists who champion naturalism in a militant way, in a militant sense, and that can foster a less objective, more biased attitude towards naturalism and give it, characterizations that it doesn't have, like it is hostile to religion and to culture, and it is bigoted against, religious people, etc. But still, when you compare who's more likely to load more into naturalism than it should, chances are it's going to be those who abuse it. So let's try to be as clear as we can about naturalism's characterizations. We said that this chapter has 6 sections. We've seen when we went through the plan of the book, how many sections are in each chapters. And the first 5 sections, they deal with the characterizations of naturalism proper, while the last one reviews what critics say about it. How they abuse, the term by attributing to it characterizations that naturalists they don't accept, and thereby reducing naturalism to a straw man. So the first section, first pass, suggests that naturalism is a conjunction of ontological naturalism or metaphysical naturalism and methodological naturalism. Ontological naturalism and metaphysical naturalism are basically the same thing. So it's the claim that the nature of reality is, naturalistic, meaning that there are only natural causal entities and natural causal powers. It's an ontological claim because it's stating the nature of being, what reality is made of. In Greek, onta means being, hence ontology is the study of what is. And methodological naturalism is the claim that naturalism is also a method of inquiry when doing science, focusing on only natural causal entities or natural causality is more practical than positing or looking for non-natural stuff. So your method of inquiry will be more reliable in a naturalist paradigm. So what Oppy is going to argue is that these two claims, ontological and methodological naturalism, they cannot be separated. You can't, for example, claim that you are a naturalist if you claim that reality is just made of natural stuff, but then when you do an inquiry, you use methods that conflict with your ontological claims and vice versa. Some people can disagree here. Some can say that you can hold non-naturalistic metaphysics or ontology, but use a naturalist methodology for inquiry. And I'll say, yeah, why not? Sure, you can be a religious believer and a scientist. Like when you do research, you use methodological naturalism. Like you see, naturalism as just a method, as a research program, which will be, the focus of one of the chapters, because one of the critiques of naturalism, Michael C. Rea, will argue that, naturalism is actually just a method of inquiry, and so it cannot be, a substantive ontological claim. But, like I said, that doesn't make you a naturalist. If you just say, that I'm a naturalist just in the methodology or just for inquiry, that doesn't make you a naturalist. To be a naturalist, you need both a naturalist ontology and a naturalist methodology. And likewise, you cannot have a naturalistic ontology or a naturalist ontology, but use a non-naturalist methodology. That would kind of defeat the purpose. So, the first characterization of naturalism is ontological and methodological naturalism. But as Oppy says, this doesn't settle much, and even if we agree on this first characterization, there are still many disagreements about naturalism from naturalists. We'll see in that section 10 points of disputes among naturalists in the first section. The first section will be about some disagreements. The second section, natural and non-natural, it goes into a second characterization of naturalism, which relies on the notions of causality and powers, and more importantly, the distinction between natural causal entities and powers and non-natural causal entities and powers. Oppy says that both notions, causal reality and causal powers, and distinction between natural and non-natural, are controversial. They can, motivate disagreements, which are reasonable disagreements, either, between naturalists themselves or with non-naturalists. First, the distinction between a natural entity and power and a non-natural entity and power can be unclear. Even naturalists don't all agree on what to classify as natural and non-natural. So if the distinction remains undecisive, does it undermine naturalism? Would it make, non-naturalist worldviews more plausible? Well, Oppy doesn't think so. He'll argue that even if we cannot give an informative explanation of natural entities and powers, meaning a decisive explanation for the distinction, it doesn't mean that we cannot make the distinction or that science will have to recognize ghosts and karma as entities and powers constitutive of reality. In other words, we cannot ask from naturalism to provide premises that we can never doubt or question, as if, naturalism has to provide absolute evidence for this distinction, because such evidence doesn't exist for anything, actually. So, this is not a cop-out move for naturalism, like, don't ask me to provide absolute evidence to justify my naturalism, and, we'll say, well, how convenient. Rather, Oppy will argue that the intuitive and ordinary distinctions that we have right now, they work perfectly fine. So the distinction isn't problematic, even if it is controversial. And then, which is also related to this point, there is the issue regarding the notions, like causal reality and powers. For naturalism, as we've seen from last episode, things exist in causal relations with one another. There is no such thing as an uncaused entity. In other words, nothing exists ex nihilo, as in it exists from nothing, as it, it hasn't been caused by anything. So everything that exists has a cause, and entities are causal because they cause and they are caused by other entities. However, naturalism argues that this causality is purely natural. Natural causal entities cannot be caused by or cause non-natural entities. Like, naturalists, they obviously don't agree that there are non-natural entities. So logically, non-natural entities, since they don't exist, cannot, cause anything. But this is also a controversial claim among naturalists too, because maybe, we can ask the question, can there be non-causal but natural entities? Should a formulation of naturalism exclude other views of naturalism? Should we appeal to causality and powers to explain the natural, or should the definition of naturalism be flexible enough to allow for diversity of metaphysical stances within naturalism? So Oppy argues that while the appeal to notions like causality and powers is fine to characterize naturalism, we should perhaps allow this freedom in metaphysical assertions or primitives, the foundational assertions and premises, because all metaphysical assertions are actually built this way. Whatever metaphysical claim you hold, no one can provide absolute evidence for it. That it would be a beyond doubt evidence. That is impossible to provide. So this works for both controversies, for the notions and also for the distinctions. So far we have two main characterizations of naturalism. It is a conjunction of methodological naturalism and metaphysical or ontological naturalism. This metaphysical naturalism lies on the metaphysical primitives that there are causal entities and powers, and these are either natural or non-natural, but only the former exists. Okay, and so this would be the third characterization of naturalism. It's a thesis about what is actually the case. Which one of these two categories of causal entities and causal powers makes reality? Is reality made of natural or non-natural entities and powers? Both? Well, naturalism claims that only natural causal entities and natural causal powers exist. But in this section, we will also see what naturalists think of what might be the case, meaning the views that hold that non-natural entities and powers might or might have existed, that it's possible for them to be, and then see why Oppy thinks that naturalism is by necessity true, even though naturalists may disagree on what makes a causal entity and power natural. So methodological and ontological / metaphysical claim, distinction between natural causal entities and powers and non-natural causal entities and powers, and 3, the thesis that only natural causal entities and powers exist and can exist. Fourth characterization, so though the thesis that only natural stuff exists holds of necessity, according to Oppy, it is not framed in terms of what's fundamental, grounding, or subvenient, but in terms of big pictures. So subvenient means what determines something else. So this is to avoid dogma about naturalism's primitives. So here we'll talk about big pictures in more details and see why framing naturalism as a big picture allows for the existence of many naturalistic big pictures, whereas if we frame naturalism in terms of subvenience, we cannot have different big pictures of naturalism. Having different big pictures within naturalism means that naturalists have the freedom to disagree about what to take, as primitives of naturalism. They all agree that only natural stuff exists, but what counts as natural, for example, can be controversial. So naturalism is a big picture that is a conjunction of methodological and metaphysical / ontological claims that there is a distinction between natural causal entities and powers and non-natural causal entities and powers, and only the former by necessity exists. And then we have the fifth characterization of Oppy's naturalism, which is about attitudes. Is there in naturalism a characterization that warrants some sort of attitude towards naturalism? Does naturalism asks for some sort of attitude from its adherence towards itself and also towards non-naturalistic worldviews? Well, for Oppy, no. Naturalism's fifth characterization is its lack of addressing the doxatic attitudes that naturalists might take towards the propositions that characterize naturalism. In other words, the propositions of naturalism, they don't ask for a specific attitude from you towards those propositions. So, wearing it as a badge of honor, for example, though you can, and that doesn't, contradict your naturalism in any way, but that is not part of naturalism itself. There's nothing in naturalism's main characterizations that would force you to have a certain attitude towards it. And so that section also brings in the difference between all or nothing naturalistic beliefs and naturalistic credences, and that there is, wide permissible variation in the magnitude and resilience of such beliefs. We will come back to that when we arrive at that section. So these are the five main characterizations of naturalism. It's 1, a big picture, that is 2, a conjunction of metaphysical / ontological and methodological claims. That 3, there is a distinction between natural causal entities and powers and non-natural causal entities and powers. And 4, only the former by necessity exists, but 5, it asks no doxatic attitude towards any of these characterizations. Now we're going to see each of these 5 characterizations in detail, and then in the 6th section we are going to go through criticism of naturalism that tends to add more characterizations to naturalism, even characterizations that naturalists themselves don't accept. So we are talking about when people abuse the term by loading way more into it than what it is, in reality. And we will see, for example, William Lane Craig and G.P. Moreland's criticism of naturalism in their 2000 book, Naturalism, A Critical Analysis. And it's going to serve as an example of abuse and strawmanning naturalism. Alright, let's start with the conjunction of methodological and metaphysical/ontological naturalism. So we insist on this conjunction because it is common to hold them separately, but naturalists better accept them both simultaneously, as Oppy says, if they want to be consistent. So let's see the definitions, and we will look at each claim separately, but like I said, it's better to never forget that to be a naturalist, you need both. So, what is ontological naturalism and what is methodological naturalism? So Oppy says, ontological naturalists maintain roughly that natural reality exhausts causal reality. There are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. And methodological naturalists maintain roughly that well-established science is our touchstone for identifying the denizens of causal reality. We have no reason to believe in causal entities and causal powers beyond those recognized by science. So, ontological naturalism claims that natural reality exhausts causal reality. So that means that all of causal reality has to be natural. Nothing that is causal, an entity or power, can be outside or doesn't belong to natural reality. So all causal entities or powers are natural. So this is the fundamental core of naturalism. And it's important to frame it this way because this allows for genuine and reasonable disagreements among naturalists about what counts as natural reality and causal powers among, other disputes. For example, does this mean that there are or can be natural non-causal entities and powers, or non-natural non-causal entities and powers? Well, Oppy said that it's natural reality that exhausts the causal one and not the other way around. This means that while causal reality can only be natural reality, this doesn't say that all of natural reality is reduced to causal reality. Maybe there is a part of natural reality that is not causal, like, you have a giant set of natural reality and within it there is a set called causal reality, but then parts of natural reality aren't causal reality. There may be, a natural non-causal reality. Or maybe there is a non-reality that is also non-causal as well. Maybe there are gods and spirits, but they don't cause and aren't caused by anything, and thereby they are neither natural nor causal. And so this will be the subject of the next section when we talk about the distinction between the natural and the non-natural. Here the question is going to be about causal entities. Can there be non-causal entities before thinking about, natural and non-natural entities? Well, a controversial issue here is the example of abstract objects, like for example numbers. For naturalists, obviously everything is natural. There is no non-natural entities, but what about natural non-causal entities like non-causal abstract objects, like for example numbers? So numbers aren't supernatural. They are not non-natural, but are they causal entities? Are they caused by or cause other entities? And apparently no. So this makes some naturalists think that abstract objects, they belong to a domain of natural reality that is non-causal, the domain of non-causal abstract objects. So apparently from naturalistic perspectives, while all causal entities are natural, not all natural entities are also causal entities. But if you are a nominalist or a fictionalist, you take numbers and mathematics as human psychological or linguistic constructs. You make them up. I mean, we as humans, we make them up from a nominalist or fictionalist perspective. We make them up because they have a practical or useful function. But there is no non-causal domain of abstract objects that exists independently of human minds. And so this is a point of disagreement among naturalists. They agree that there is only natural reality, but they don't agree about what makes natural reality. They agree that natural reality exhausts causal reality, but the disagreement is between whether there is only natural causal reality, or besides natural causal reality, there is also natural non-causal reality. So to avoid any dogma, it is best to limit ontological naturalism to just, natural reality exhausts causal reality, and thereby permitting disagreements among naturalists about whether to include natural non-causal reality in this, if it exists or not. So what matters is that causal reality is naturalistic. The second point of dispute is about causal powers. What kind of natural causal powers are there? Obviously, physical and material causal powers exist, and naturalism accounts for them. But what about mental causal powers? Do they exist, and are they different from the others, from the physical and material causal powers? For the naturalists that say that they do, they, according to Oppy, they identify mental causal powers with neural causal powers. Mental states and processes are just neural states and processes. But this can be a point of weakness brought up by those who deny mental causal powers. If they are identified with neural states and processes, which are, physical and material causal powers, then why speak of another kind of causal power? If you want to give a proper scientific, psychological explanation of what individuals say or do, you can formulate that explanation exclusively in the vocabulary of neural events and processes. And so obviously here we are talking about causal powers for naturalists. So any talk about how your mentality has causal powers on your behavior or body, for example, has to be a naturalistic talk. You cannot take your mentality, for example, as a non-natural entity, or that its causal powers are non-natural. So no mysticism or soul must be involved here. Mentality or the mind or your psychology is caused by and causes natural entities as well, and therefore it is a natural entity too. We'll also touch on this when we'll mention the question of free will later on. So if our mental states have causal powers, then those powers are obviously natural causal powers. But then, since they are natural, they are best explained by your neurons, by the physical stuff that makes your brain and body. So the term mental causal powers seems obsolete and confusing. Another thing that is obvious is that there cannot be a non-causal power contrary to entities. While naturalists can disagree about whether there are non-causal entities, when it comes to powers, all powers must be causal, otherwise it's not a power. So they all agree that causal powers are natural, but they can disagree about what counts as a causal power. And the third point of disagreement is also related to causal powers. It's about properties. Are all properties causal powers? We're talking about, the properties of a thing here. When the stove is hot, for example, the water boils. So the stove's temperature is its property, and clearly it is causing the water to boil, and therefore it is a causal power. So all entities have properties, and their causal powers are just their properties. For a property to be known, it has to affect us or its surroundings, and therefore a property is a causal power. But the question is, are there properties that have no or aren't causal powers? By which I mean, are there properties that have no power, since we established that powers are by necessity causal? And naturalists, they can disagree on this. Some argue that not all properties are causal powers, and this can be because, as Oppy points, of verbal disputes around the term property, or more importantly because of the ambiguous status of certain types of properties like moral and aesthetic properties. There doesn't seem to be controversies about physical properties. Everyone agrees that they are causal powers, but moral and aesthetic properties, like when I say this action or this person is moral or this painting is beautiful, this is different from saying the stove is hot or that the cat is black or that the suitcase is heavy. So, hot, black, and heavy, as properties, they are causal powers. They are properties that belong to the object, and they cause something on those entities. They cause something in those entities. but this painting is beautiful and this man is good in a moral sense. These are called normative properties. And some naturalists, they deny that such properties are causal powers. The objects that possess these properties, they don't cause anything through these properties. The suitcase that possesses the property heavy causes something through the fact of being heavy. The property heavy is a causal power. But the man that possesses the property good doesn't cause anything by the fact of being good. He rather did something, like help a blind person cross the street or said nice things, etc. These can be related to physical properties since these are physical acts. They obviously cause something, but it's these physical properties that are doing the causing. It's not the normative property of moral. So this isn't to say that normative properties don't exist. Rather, even though the man has the property moral, that property isn't a causal power. Same thing with, for example, the painting is beautiful. The shapes and colors on the paintings are, doing something to me. They are affecting me. They are causing me to experience something. And those are physical or material properties. But it is them that do the causing. It's not the property beautiful. So there are naturalists who say that that there are properties that are not causal powers, like normative properties, and other naturalists, however, deny that there are such things. There are no normative properties. They stem only from anti-realist expectations or explanations, And anti-realism is the philosophical view that denies the existence of objective reality or mind-independent reality, a reality that exists independently of our mind. Reality is instead a construct of human thought, language, and society. So in the context of normative properties, this view argues that such properties aren't objective features of reality. There is no such thing as a moral man or a beautiful painting, objectively speaking. So claiming that these properties exist, it stems from either theoretical errors or fictions that we use for practical reasons, like numbers or abstract objects, for those who deny their existence. So in other words, are there properties that are not causal powers is the third point of disagreement, but they all agree that there are only natural properties. Fourth and fifth point of disagreement is also about ontology, and it is naturalistic ontology. The question is naturalistic ontology a physicalist ontology? Is it physicalism? That's the fourth point. To say that there are only natural causal entities and powers, is it the same as saying that there are only physical causal entities with none but physical causal powers? Or can there be non-physical natural entities and powers? What does really count as natural entity and power here? Some naturalists say that there are non-physical natural causal entities or causal powers, and Oppy gives the example of chemical powers. Some say that there are just, a suitably rearranged and configured physical powers or, of molecules, and so these deny that chemical powers are non-physical. This is the physicalist view. Everything that exists is physical, and all causal powers are physical powers. But some naturalists disagree, suggesting that there are causal powers at higher levels that are not reducible to physical powers. These are those, who claim that chemical powers, for example, are emergent with respect to physical powers. Something is emergent if it arises from a more fundamental level but cannot be fully explained or reduced to that level. In this case, chemical powers emerge from physical powers. They depend on physical entities, but they cannot be completely described in purely, physical terms. And so these naturalists, they also make the same claim for biological or psychological powers. Biological or psychological powers, they emerge from chemical/physical processes. Life or metabolisms emerge from chemical processes in cells, but you cannot fully describe a living cell just by listing its chemical reactions. And so the same thing with consciousness also. You can say that consciousness emerges from physical or neurological processes, but you cannot reduce it to those processes. Then you have the fifth point of disagreement, which is exactly like the one about physical entities and powers, but this time it's with material entities and powers. Some naturalists are physicalists, while others are materialists. Materialism claims that there are only material causal entities with none but material causal powers. And so here again, can there be non-material natural causal powers and entities? And it's going to depend on what you mean by material causal entities. If you take them in a pre-Newtonian sense, then naturalists are ontological materialists, since pre-Newtonian concept of matter means that fundamentally the universe is composed of indivisible atoms that interact solely via contact. Like, one particle pushes or collides with another, and so forces at a distance like gravity were not yet understood back then, and so matter had inherent, qualities like hardness, density, shape, or size, and these were the basis of how it causes effects in the world. So in short, pre-Newtonian materialists thought of the universe as a giant machine made of, little solid pieces pushing each other around. Thing is, no contemporary naturalist uses pre-Newtonian concepts of matter. Given that they, reject this claim, then it's obvious that naturalists accept non-material causal entities and powers as, natural causal entities and powers as well. But again, even if, if you use the term material to mean simply everything that is natural, you use it, in a very broad and loose sense, then yeah, all naturalists are ontological materialists. So these last 2 points can be used by critics to make, straw man of naturalism, given that naturalists, they don't uniformly call themselves ontological physicalists or materialists, but because they recognize that they need a broader term to characterize ontological reality than just physical or material causal reality or causal, entities and powers, they can, they call themselves naturalists. And so we cannot criticize naturalists with the charge of being reductionists. So these are the points of disagreements among naturalists about ontology. We said that what characterizes ontological naturalism is that there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. But then it's allowed to have disagreements about whether there can be natural non-causal entities, about what kinds of causal powers there are, whether all properties are causal powers, and whether these entities and powers by natural are meant to be physical or material only. The next points are about methodological naturalism, which supports ontological naturalism. Since ontological naturalism claims that there are only natural causal entities with natural causal powers, it's important to justify why we believe that. And so this is where methodological naturalism comes in. So for a reminder, methodological naturalism claims that well-established science is our touchstone for identifying the denizens of causal reality, and that we have no reason to believe in causal entities and causal powers beyond those recognized by science. So here, since science is the best tool we have to identify the denizens of causal reality, and so far it's only, it has only revealed natural causal entities and causal powers, and it doesn't seem to have any intention or method to reveal non-natural entities or powers in the future, it is safe to say that we have no good reasons to believe in the existence of those non-natural entities. And so this argument can, however, face limits. Firstly, it can be met with the charge of scientism, meaning that scientific inquiry is the only proper form of inquiry. Like if the point of inquiry is to understand and identify the denizens of reality, and from our definition we said that science is the best tool for that, then we can end up arguing that scientific inquiry is the only proper form of inquiry, right? And while some naturalists, they can embrace scientism, many don't endorse it. So for the former, whatever topic you have, only science can be a reliable source of knowledge about it. Even topics traditionally studied in the humanities, like topics in philosophy, human history, literature, music, and the arts, the best way to practice these modes of inquiry is through science. Okay, so that's scientism. Every question that was traditionally the proper of philosophy would either be better answered with science, or if science cannot answer it, it's considered a misleading question and should be discarded. From here we see that scientism subordinates all other forms of inquiry, downgrading them and even, discarding them as useless, like they don't have anything substantial to say about reality. And the latter, those who disagree with this, the naturalists who do not embrace scientism, they insist on the autonomous authority of the humanities, arguing, for example, that science may be the touchstone for identifying natural causal entities and natural causal powers, meaning the properties of those entities. But if we admit that those entities can also possess normative properties, so properties, but that aren't necessarily causal properties, or that natural non-causal entities exist, then science would have to admit that it is not the only reliable source of knowledge. So yeah, like Oppy says, it is true that the natural causal entities studied in the humanities are all recognized by science, but their properties as non-causal powers are only properly understood from the standpoint of the humanities. And if there are non-causal entities, like for example abstract objects that are studied in humanities, then those entities may lie entirely beyond the purview of the sciences. Then you have the seventh point of dispute, which is about humanism. Given that naturalism rejects non-natural entities and powers and is characterized by the claim that science is the touchstone of figuring out natural entities and powers, what are the political implications of such methodology? Though this can, also be related to ontological naturalism. So humanism argues that human agency, human freedom, and human progress are fundamental values. And sure, naturalists can embrace humanism since their denial of non-natural causal entities and powers, politically speaking and historically, was about motivating human beings to take their agency, freedom, and progress between their own hands. But not all naturalists endorse humanism. Other naturalists think that humanism is too parochial, meaning narrow. They may agree that agency, freedom, and progress are fundamental values, but they criticize humanism for limiting those values to humanity alone, or making them about humans alone. Fundamental values are here understood as universal values, but humanism makes them fundamental values for humans alone, for example. It's in the sense that humanists are too narrow and they are, species-centered, like they are speciesists, and hence they are parochial. Other naturalists can just, reject those values as fundamental or as simply, values, and thereby rejecting humanism. And these disputes can also be just verbal disputes about what humanists claim to be values. These can amount to mere verbal disagreements about those terms, like agency, freedom, and progress. For example, many naturalists are determinists, and thus if humanists, they take libertarian freedom, the idea that human choices are not fully determined by prior causes, as a value, a determinist, since he denies that such, freedom exists, she won't, accept that libertarian freedom is a fundamental value. Others, though, may be compatibilists, meaning someone who argues that free will is compatible with determinism. They would reject humanism if humanism champions a libertarian freedom, but they may accept compatibilist freedom as a fundamental value instead. The eighth point of dispute among naturalists is about first philosophy. So first philosophy means metaphysics, but in a deeper sense than in metaphysical naturalism. Here we don't mean just an account of reality, but the study of the most fundamental principles of reality. The causes of reality, that which does not change and being as such. So the dispute is about whether naturalists should endorse first philosophy. Some say no, that investigations into first causes, being as such, or things that are unchanging are either meaningless or irrelevant to science. First philosophy is basically going deeper than science. It's about, like we said, establishing the fundamental principles of everything. And since naturalism claims that science is the touchstone for identifying natural causal entities and powers, relying on first philosophy means going into domains beyond the natural. The first causes, they are not necessarily, they aren't non-causal entities or powers. Like they are not like normative properties where we can accept that science isn't the only proper mode of inquiry. So given that these first causes are themselves causal principles, they are, causes after all, and since they are beyond scientific inquiry, that they are, claim to be the very conditions for science itself, then it is difficult to conceive of them as natural causal entities and powers. So taken in this sense, naturalism seems incompatible with first philosophy. But as Oppy says, this is only to the extent where we take first philosophy in the Aristotelian sense. Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, he calls the study of being as such, or first causes, the highest form of philosophy, and by first causes, the ultimate explanation of why things exist or why events happen. So these first causes, they cause everything else, but they themselves aren't caused, and hence they don't change. And so they are unchanging fundamental principles or entities, like Aristotle's famous unmoved mover that in Thomism is equated with God, and we will go back to this in the second part of the chapter, Does Religion Defeat Naturalism? So taken in this Aristotelian sense, first philosophy seems to be about non-natural causal entities and powers. But Oppy argues that nothing compels us to accept this view of first philosophy. We can have actually a naturalistic first philosophy, even if it is a controversial claim. There are, as Oppy says, naturalists who suppose that there is an initial state of the causal order. If we suppose an initial state to the series of causal events that make our universe, then yes, we are bound to accept that there is at least one kind of first cause. But that doesn't mean that the first cause is a non-natural entity or has non-natural causal powers, since after all, if we are naturalists, it's also because we see that non-naturalistic big pictures are more theoretically confusing and problematic than naturalistic ones. So it's okay for naturalists to presuppose a first cause. Likewise, if first causes are also unchanging, since they are also uncaused, that doesn't force us into accepting non-naturalistic unmoved movers or non-naturalistic entities and powers. We already accept that, there are certain kinds of conserved quantities that characterize our universe, like energy or momentum in physics, so we are also bound to accept that there are features of our universe that do not change. Still, within methodology, the ninth point now of dispute regards epistemology. So this is about naturalist stances to take on disputes between rationalism and empiricism. So rationalists, they argue that we have innate concepts and innate knowledge, while empiricists, they argue that experience is the ultimate source of all of our concepts and knowledge. So you can have disputes between naturalists on this. Some are rationalists, while others are empiricists. And Oppy adds that you also have many differences regarding responses to skepticism as well. So naturalists may have, it's not that they have different views regarding epistemology, and yet they all agree that science is the touchstone for identifying the denizens of reality. So the disputes will be about epistemological stances within scientific consensus. And the last point of dispute, and this one is an ontological one because it's about causal entities themselves. I don't know why Oppy put it at the end, by the way. And it's about the spatial temporality of natural causal entities. Surprisingly, as Oppy notes, some naturalists, they argue that there are natural causal entities that aren't spatio-temporally located entities, or that at least we should be skeptical about denying their existence. And so these naturalists are, however, in the minority. Most naturalists, they claim that the universe is a distribution of fields over a single spatio-temporal manifold, meaning that everything in the universe is located in the spatio-temporal manifold that makes the universe. Every natural causal entity is located in space and time. So every natural causal entity has to be a spatio-temporal located entity. But like Oppy said, this is to a point of dispute, even though it's very difficult to argue for the existence of entities that don't exist in time and space and yet have causal powers over entities in time and space. So unless we are talking about non-causal natural entities, like for example abstract objects, like maybe those they are not located in space and time. But if you are going to talk about causal entities and powers, it's very hard to see how they can be causing anything if they are not within space and time. So these are the 10 points of disputes within naturalism. Now we can move to the second characterization, natural and non-natural. So we've seen that there are many points on which naturalists disagree. We can even say that they have more points of disagreement than of agreement. And after all, what do they agree about besides the basic definition of naturalism, that there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers? And even on that point, they are not all in agreement, since some argue that there might be natural non-causal entities such as abstract objects and non-causal powers such as normative properties. But for the sake of the argument, let's say that this is the main point of agreement, that there are only natural causal entities with natural causal powers. So where do we go from there? Well, if naturalists agree on that claim, they must also agree to everything that is entailed by that claim. Whatever necessarily follows from that claim must be agreed upon by naturalists. So what does the claim, there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers, entail? Well, obviously, that there are no non-natural causal entities with non-natural causal powers. About the question whether there might be non-natural, non-causal entities with non-natural, non-causal powers, that is completely irrelevant and obsolete here. If any entity is neither natural nor causal, is neither caused or can cause anything, it has no causal power, then what's the point of even considering its existence? It can neither affect nor be affected, so it is completely pointless to contemplate its existence. So we are only interested in non-natural causal entities and non-natural causal powers. So let's see what can count as that. The first clue can be from the second claim of naturalism, that well-established science is the touchstone for identifying natural causal entities with natural causal powers. So science identifies only natural causal entities and powers. So from this, we can say that a non-natural causal entity and non-causal power, non-natural causal power, are those that aren't recognized by science. So let's see at what causal entity science doesn't. Let's look at what causal entity science doesn't recognize. As Oppy says, it is not controversial that science does not recognize ancestor spirits, astral intelligence, demons, divas, fairies, ghosts, gods, gremlins, mermaids, trolls, vampires, werewolves, witches, wizards, yeti, zombies, and the like. So obviously these entities are often portrayed as having causal powers, since they affect and can be affected by the natural world. In the media in which they are depicted, we are often see them as having causal powers. But they are non-natural entities since science doesn't recognize them. So yeah, let's clarify that non-natural doesn't have to be confined to immaterial or non-physical stuff like souls, spirits, or ghosts and demons, but also to entities that are depicted in complete physical or material forms like werewolves or zombies. So the same applies to fictional realistic characters like Sherlock Holmes. Even though he is completely human and has causal powers in his depictions, he is a non-natural entity since he is a fiction. So, the fiction of Sherlock Holmes is a natural entity, but the character himself isn't. So that's for, non-natural causal entities. Now let's see non-natural causal powers. So Oppy says, moreover, it is not controversial that science does not allow that chi, kami, karma, samsara, sat, the Tao, and so forth play causal roles in our universe. So this also includes chakra, ki, nen, magic, and all of the anime power systems that you can think of, obviously. So this seems to be a straight-up case, since, established science doesn't recognize these entities and powers, then they are non-natural entities and powers, and therefore we can deny their existence. It's as simple as that. But is it? Well, not really. The argument is just that naturalists don't believe that these entities and powers exist because they are not recognized by science. And so far it's true. If naturalists believe only in what is recognized by science, then it follows that whatever lies beyond what is recognized by science won't be believed by naturalists. And so this naturally follows from our premise so far. But what doesn't follow is all of the listed entities are non-natural causal entities and that all of the listed powers are non-natural causal powers. Indeed, the only thing we have to assert that is in our premises, we didn't just say that, science doesn't recognize them, but that also science only recognizes natural entities and powers. But this presupposes that science, and thus naturalism, they know, that science knows what is a natural entity and power, and thereby it can identify and distinguish it from a non-natural entity and power. And this is the second characterization of naturalism, right? That it relies upon distinctions between A, natural and non-natural causal entities, and B, natural and non-natural causal powers. But what if science is wrong? What if it is dismissing causal entities and powers that are in fact natural and mistake them for non-natural ones? So we need to ask what really counts as natural here. Is science really good at making the distinction? What if the distinction turns out to be more complex than science takes it to be? What would happen then? As Oppy asks, but what can these distinctions be informatively explained? And if these distinctions cannot be informatively explained, does that somehow cast doubt on the characterization of naturalism? Would anything be lost if naturalists gave upon ontological naturalism and nailed their colors exclusively to the mast of methodological naturalism? Why not say that naturalists believe in just those causal entities and causal powers that are recognized by science? So, if we cannot informatively explain these distinctions between natural and non-natural, meaning if we cannot give a clear, non-circular, substantial account of what the distinction between natural and non-natural entities and powers is, such that someone who doesn't already understand the distinction would actually learn something new from the explanation. If we cannot do that, if all we can say, for example, is what's natural is what science recognizes, or natural entities are entities with natural powers, or natural things are those that belong to the natural world, such answers, well, they don't informatively explain anything about the distinction. So if we cannot provide such explanations, what would it mean for naturalism? There can be at least three consequences if the distinction cannot be informatively explained, as put in the question, in the forms of questions. First, we would doubt the characterization of naturalism. Second, naturalism will have to give up on ontological naturalism, since it cannot give an informative explanation of the distinction between the natural and the non-natural. It cannot assert that there are only natural entities and powers, and thus it must argue that it's just a method of inquiry that presupposes this category of the natural for practical reasons. And three, maybe we'll just say that we believe in entities and powers that are recognized by science and give up the adjective natural, meaning that we don't say that science recognizes natural entities and powers, but simply causal entities and powers. So we have four questions. Can we make an informative explanation of the distinction between natural and unnatural entities and powers? And three other questions that pop up if our answer to the first question is no. So, how can we respond to these questions? Well, the easy way is to say yes to the first question. But Oppy suggests that even if we say no to it, we actually don't have to be challenged by the other three questions, meaning that we don't have to accept the three consequences, which are doubting the characterization of naturalism, give up on ontological naturalism, and the adjective natural. Oppy offers two responses to the questions: the primitive distinction response and the science recognition response. So let's start with the first one, the primitive distinction. So, to the question, can we provide an informative explanation of the distinction between natural and non-natural? This response says, not really, but so what? We can provide a primitive distinction which isn't really an informative explanation, but that's okay. It doesn't mean that we suddenly gave up on ontological naturalism or doubt the characterization of naturalism. A primitive distinction is a distinction that cannot or need not be explained in more fundamental terms, yet it is still meaningful and stable. That's what he means by that some distinctions do not admit of illuminating explanation in other terms. We just, take the distinction for granted and just roll with it. I don't need to use illuminating other terms to explain what is natural and what is non-natural. Everyone can more or less intuitively know what is meant by those categories, and we all more or less understand each other when we use those terms. So I don't need to bring definitions of the natural and the non-natural deeper than the ordinary use of those terms. Like Oppy says, we have good reasons to suppose that ordinary distinctions between the natural and the non-natural are in reasonably good working order. It is not as if we simply draw blanks or reach for our revolvers when other people make use of the words natural and non-natural in the kinds of context in which we are now operating. And it seems to be consonant with the ways in which we ordinarily use these terms that the entities and powers listed above are non-natural. So, it's a basic distinction. It serves as a starting point for reasoning or classification of entities without needing a deeper non-circular explanation of it. The ordinary understanding of natural and non-natural works perfectly already. For example, even though we don't have an informative explanation of the distinction, no one would doubt that the entities and powers that we listed a few minutes ago can be mistaken for natural ones. Everyone agrees that werewolves are non-natural entities even if they believe that they exist. Or take the example of souls and spirits. Many people believe in their existence, right? Yet they don't call them natural entities. They all agree that they are non-natural, that they transcend the natural realm. Even people who believe in magic and other powers of that kind, they rarely refer to them as natural powers. And they tend to proudly affirm that the powers in which they believe in are deeper than the natural stuff that science is concerned with. Now, sure, some can argue that we should be unsatisfied with primitive distinctions, and we should instead try to provide informative explanations for these distinctions. But nothing compels us to do so, at least, logically speaking. We haven't violated any epistemological or logical rule when we go with primitive distinctions between natural and non-natural entities and powers. It can be stimulating and it can satisfy some sort of intellectual curiosity, but that will be, like satisfying desires. It's not going to be satisfying our needs if we demand an informative explanation. When Oppy says, but as even rock stars have noted, at least inter alia, desires must sometimes remain unsatisfied, he refers to the Rolling Stones' 1969 song, You Cannot Always Get What You Want. And inter alia means, among other things, in Latin. But the reference to the Rolling Stones is that, well, you may want an informative explanation about the distinctions, but you cannot always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, you may find what you need, which is a primitive distinction. Okay, so that's the first response. We say to the question, can we make an informative, deep distinction? No, but you can make a primitive distinction, and that is enough. So you avoid the consequences. The second response now simply says that natural causal entities and natural causal powers are just those causal entities and causal powers that are recognized by science. In other words, how do we make distinction between the natural and the non-natural? Well, we simply say that whatever science recognizes as a causal entity and causal power is natural. Whatever it doesn't recognize as such, it is non-natural. But wait, isn't that precisely the problem? If we give that response, well, haven't we accepted that we must give up ontological naturalism and embrace methodological naturalism? Plus, wouldn't that mean that naturalists simply believe in the causal entities and powers recognized by science, but that wouldn't tell us what makes them natural? Naming an entity natural simply by virtue of being recognized by science, just because it is recognized by science, seems like, burning a few crucial steps, right? You don't believe in natural entities and powers, but simply in whatever science recognizes them. And so this doesn't allow you to make any ontological substantive claim. So all you do is follow a method of inquiry, but that doesn't allow you to draw any conclusions about how things really are. You have trapped yourself in an anti-realist paradigm now. And so this then would make us vulnerable to further questions. Oppy thinks of the following questions. Are the natural causal entities and natural causal powers those that are recognized by current science? Are the natural causal entities and natural causal powers those that are recognized by best future science? Are the natural causal entities and natural causal powers those that are recognized by ideal science? And if what matters is recognition by best future science or ideal science, why should we suppose that science really does fail to recognize those entities and powers listed above? And indeed, if you say that the natural is whatever science recognizes, the fact that science has itself recognized entities and powers in the past that it doesn't recognize now means that what naturalists took to be natural at one point turned out to be non-natural today. So what makes us confident that current science, the well-established science, is in a different position today? Maybe what you take today as natural entities will become non-natural entities in the future, in future science. So when we say natural causal entities and natural causal powers are those recognized by science, which science are we talking about? The current one? The best future one? That means, the best possible science humans can reach? Or ideal science, meaning a science so pure that it cannot be wrong? If you say, well, current science, well, you run into the problem that we mentioned, that it changes all the time. If you say best future science, well, how would you know that science is still in the future? How do you know, that science, since, it is still in the future? If you say ideal science, again, how would you know since that science is out of reach for human minds? Plus, the fourth question says that if what matters is what best future or ideal science recognizes, like they are the true authorities here, not current science, then how can we rule out with confidence that listed entities and powers as non-natural if it's only current science that rules them out as such? So it seems here that we must accept the consequences, doubt naturalism's characterization, embrace methodological naturalism, and accept that in reality we are just accepting causal entities and powers, not necessarily natural ones. But in truth, no, we don't have to accept these consequences. Let's start with that fourth question. The objection holds that if we consider science as the touchstone of identifying natural entities, we run into a self-defeating proposition since current science is unreliable in that regard, and our standards must either be best future science or ideal science, which we don't have right now. So we cannot say that science is the touchstone of identifying natural entities. Now, why does this objection fail? Well, it's because our claim, the naturalist claim that science is the touchstone, etc., isn't just that that the listed entities and powers, the werewolves, the karma, are not recognized by current science. If the naturalist claim was just that, then yeah, sure, naturalism would have some serious challenges to face. But naturalism says more than just werewolves aren't recognized by current science. It actually says there is no reason to doubt that the listed entities and powers will not be recognized by any future science, and nor would they be recognized by ideal science if there were such a thing. I mean, sure, current science faces flaws, and it is, it is not complete science and will likely, evolve in the future. But this doesn't mean that we can never know or can never have a good reason to be confident in some assertions about future science. There is, for example, absolutely no evidence to suggest that the listed entities and powers will one day be recognized by science, whether future science or ideal science. There has to be a certain flexibility allowed in this. Even when we look at the trajectory of science, whether we project, science in the future, unless you want to go into pure speculation and sci-fi scenarios, nothing suggests that future science will be so radically different from our current established science to the point where entities and powers like the one listed, if not, from the list itself, can become recognized by science. In other words, by recognizing the incomplete character of current science, by admitting that it is, it's probably mistaken in some parts, we can still be confident that the listed entities and powers won't be officially recognized by a future science or an ideal science. Like, it would be more reasonable to agree that despite the evolutive character of science, the listed entities and powers won't be recognized by any future or ideal science, than it is to speculate, that maybe, just maybe, it is a possibility that future and ideal science will recognize some of the listed entities and powers or similar new ones. Or because, of that possibility, naturalism becomes inconsistent and must give up on ontological naturalism. So even with that possibility, naturalism still holds because that possibility is so unlikely that we shouldn't even give it the slightest relevance here. So by responding this way to that fourth question, we can now respond to the other three. Are the natural causal entities and natural causal powers those that are recognized by current science or by best science or by ideal science? And the answer is yes, yes, and yes. Natural causal entities and powers are those recognized by current science, but also natural causal entities and natural causal powers are those that would be recognized in ideal science, and non-natural causal entities and non-natural causal powers are those that would not be recognized in ideal science. So the fact that our current science is incomplete, it doesn't make the distinction between the natural and the non-natural obsolete, because an ideal science would still, make this distinction. In an ideal science would just, certainly be able to know all the natural entities and powers and all the non-natural ones without committing any mistake. And a best future science, even if it's not an ideal science, would just be, better than our current science at identifying natural entities and powers, which is already pretty decent at doing that. But the distinction between the natural and the non-natural would remain. What would ideal and best future science do is probably recognize more natural ones and more efficiently than current ones. Current science simply doesn't know all of the natural causal entities and natural causal powers that would be recognized in ideal science, and all of the natural causal entities and non-natural causal powers that would not be recognized in ideal science. But we can identify many of them already, and with good enough confidence that the ones identified now will remain in future ideal science. In short, we can rest assured that no future science is going to tell us, and ideal science would not tell us, that there are spirits, ancestor spirits, astral intelligences, demons, divas, fairies, ghosts, gods, gremlins, mermaids, trolls, vampires, werewolves, witches, wizards, yeti, and zombies and the like. No future science is going to tell us, And ideal science would not tell us that chi, karma, kami, samsara, sad, the Tao, and so forth play causal roles in our universe. Plus, even if the entities currently recognized by science turn out to be non-natural one day, the science of that time will still consider new entities and powers as natural, and thereby we would still use the well-established science of that future as touchstone for recognizing natural causal entities and powers. So both ontological naturalism and methodological naturalism would still hold in future and ideal science. Just because what we consider natural can change as science in the future evolve, that doesn't mean that we have to doubt the distinction between natural and non-natural entities and doubt that well-established science is the touchstone to identify them. So these are the two responses. The first one, the primitive distinctions. We don't need a sophisticated theory to distinguish natural from non-natural ones. Our pre-theoretical grasp of these distinctions works perfectly fine. We can accurately predict which entities and powers naturalists will classify as natural and which entities and powers naturalists will classify as non-natural. And the second one is that current science is our guide to ideal science. What we currently do in science can give us already an idea about what ideal science can look like or say about the distinction between natural and non-natural entities. So, what current science already recognizes and doesn't recognize will likely be also recognized and not recognized in ideal science. Our judgments about what is natural or non-natural are not merely judgments about the deliverances of current science, they are also judgments about what would be the deliverances of ideal science. And thus, we can bring the two responses together and say that an ideal science would deliver the same verdict we arrived at with our pre-theoretical distinctions, that there is a distinction between natural and non-natural entities, and we can trust science in identifying them. So, that settles the big issue about the distinction between the natural and the non-natural. We said that it is the second characteristic of naturalism after the conjunction of ontological and methodological claim. That being said, there is still another controversial point of this second characterization. As we said, Oppy's characterization of naturalism is that naturalists are committed to the following two claims. A, current science is our touchstone for identifying the denizens of causal reality, and B, natural reality exhausts causal reality. There are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. So this is what naturalism is fundamentally. It adverts to causal entities, causal powers, and causal realities. Adverts means it refers to causal entities, powers, and reality. Natural reality, ontological naturalism, adverts to causal entities, powers, and reality, meaning causal reality. So it adverts in the sense of exhausts it. Natural reality covers all of causal reality. There is no part of causal reality that isn't natural reality. Even causal entity or causal power that has to be every causal entity and causal power has to be a natural entity or power, and therefore naturalism accounts for causal reality. But we've seen in the previous section, we've seen about the disagreements among naturalists, that they don't all share the characterization framed in terms of causation, because some can find that this leaves out natural entities that are non-causal, while others don't share the characterization framed in terms of powers, because some can find that this leaves out natural properties that aren't causal powers, like normative properties. So, some naturalists can disagree with Oppy's main characterization of naturalism, that natural reality exhausts causal reality. There are, none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. Instead, that prefer saying that natural reality is reality, not just limited to causal reality and or causal powers, and therefore we shouldn't say that science is to identify natural causal entities and powers, because once we equate natural reality to reality as a whole, there is no point in using the term natural here. Science doesn't just identify the denizens of natural reality, but of reality tout court. Whatever science doesn't recognize doesn't exist. As simple as that. So any other way to frame the characterization of naturalism would be 1. Current science is our touchstone for identifying what there is, and B. Natural reality exhausts reality. There are none but natural entities with none but natural properties. And Oppy is fine with that. I mean, he's not fine with this new formulation, but he's fine with avoiding to characterize naturalism in ways that rule out the existence of natural non-causal entities such as abstract objects. There are, some naturalists who deny the existence of abstract objects, and Oppy agrees more with them than with those who claim that they exist. However, there is no reason to frame naturalism in a way that rules out their existence, believing that there are non-causal entities as long as they are natural entities and or might be recognized by an ideal science doesn't challenge naturalism itself. So we don't know whether abstract objects exist, but they can exist. It's possible for an ideal science to recognize them contrary to the listed entities and powers. So it is important that we also make room for them in case they turn out to be real. So given that they are non-causal, they don't pose a threat to naturalism's ontology or methodology, as causal non-natural entities and powers. So we should frame naturalism in a way that won't force us into concluding that there are non-natural entities, which would undermine naturalism if abstract objects turn out to exist. So we shouldn't find ourselves in a situation where if there are abstract objects, then we will have to conclude that there are non-natural entities. The issue, according to Oppy, is that the second formulation would force us there. The alternative definition, the one saying natural reality exhausts reality, it actually leaves, ironically, it leaves no space for abstract objects. It says only natural entities exists if it has, already an a priori ruled out abstract objects, whereas Oppy's preferred characterization doesn't precisely because Oppy's definition talks about causal reality as natural reality. So by limiting naturalism's claim to only causal reality instead of reality as a whole, he doesn't a priori exclude non-causal entities as abstract objects. He only says that we know that all of causal reality is natural reality and that all causal entities have causal powers, but he doesn't exclude the possibility of non-causal entities in natural reality. Therefore, that alternative definition, though it may seem to be broader at first glance, would wrongly exclude some views that deserve to be called naturalistic, like naturalists who accept abstract objects. But ultimately, what matters to Oppy isn't much if we can make a definitive and decisive distinction between natural and non-natural entities and powers. What matters is that the listed entities and powers don't get to be anything else but non-natural entities and powers. Naturalists are free to come up with their own definition of naturalism and formulate it as they wish. It's only better if those definitions don't depend upon the stance taken on the various questions on which naturalists disagree. In short, the definition of naturalism should be broad enough so that it doesn't rule out any genuine disagreement. Oppy's definition uses causal powers and causation, but he allows naturalists who dislike those concepts to redefine naturalism using their preferred metaphysics. They can reject the metaphysical ideas of powers and maybe even reject causation entirely. Philosophers have, different philosophical and metaphysical commitments, and that's okay. Depending on those commitments, they will also, propose different versions of naturalism. And so, where Oppy relies on powers and causations, other naturalists might instead use different concepts. They can appeal to laws of nature instead, laws as universal regularities that describe how the natural world behaves. A naturalist who believes to laws instead of powers claims that the world's behavior is explained by law-governed natural regularities instead of causal powers, and certainly not by, of course, supernatural intervention. Here, the causation is derivative. Things happen because the law says so. So this kind of naturalism will say that there are none but entities that obey natural laws. We don't need talk of intrinsic powers. Laws do the explanatory work. Or they may appeal to contrafactual dependencies, which are relations between events expressed in terms of what would happen if something else had or had not occurred, regardless of whether that condition actually exists. A contrafactual statement is, for example, if P had happened, Q would have happened. Or if P had not happened, Q would not have happened. A familiar example is, if the watch were struck, it would light. If the match were struck, it would light. A contrafactual dependency exists when Q reliably varies with P across relevant hypothetical scenarios. For a naturalist who relies on contrafactuals, causation is not understood as the exercise of irreducible causal powers, but as emerging from the stable contrafactual patterns that characterize the physical world. Contrafactuals are typically evaluated by considering how things would unfold across a range of systematically constructed hypothetical situations. The claim if P then Q is true if, in the most relevant hypothetical cases in which P holds, Q also holds. And so these hypothetical scenarios or situations are not natural entities or components of the physical universe. They are just hypothetical devices used to clarify how contrafactual relations function. So to make this concrete, consider a commonly cited example. If kangaroos did not have tails, they would topple over. Here, P is the proposition that kangaroos lack tails, and Q is the proposition that they topple over. So, to evaluate the contrafactual, we consider the most relevant hypothetical situation in which kangaroos have no tails. In that situation, their balance is compromised and they topple over, and this confirms, the truth of the contrafactual. This does not imply that tailless kangaroos exist as natural entities, only that imagining such cases is part of the theoretical machinery for understanding contrafactuals. I would also say that this particular example of the kangaroo comes from a philosopher who argues for the existence of other possible worlds beside ours. I'm talking about David Lewis, who uses contrafactual arguments to justify their existence, but this isn't relevant for us here. I mean, we can debate, over what naturalists think of possible worlds. Are they natural entities or not, like abstract objects? But it's besides the point. What matters for naturalism here is that entities like ghosts, demons, and other supernatural beings remain non-natural because they do not participate in any stable network of contrafactual dependencies grounded in the actual physical structure of the world. Suppose, one hears a door creak, and someone suggests that a ghost caused it. The associated contrafactual would be, if a ghost pushed the door, it would creak. When we examine whether this, contrafactual belongs to any stable explanatory network supported by the actual world, we find that the door would creak even if the supposed ghost were removed. The most, relevant hypothetical scenarios to our world explain the creaking in entirely ordinary physical terms: humidity, air pressure, or the mechanics of the hinges. So scenarios in which ghosts affect physical objects, are so remote from our actual world that they cannot figure in our best explanatory principles. So for this reason, the contrafactual, if you removed the ghost, the door would still creak, is true in the most relevant hypothetical scenario or situations, and this shows that the ghost hypothesis adds nothing to the explanation. Thus, even within a contrafactual-based naturalism, one that avoids talk of causal powers, entities like ghosts remain non-natural. So they do not enter explanatory contrafactual structures, and so their removal makes no difference to the events we seek to explain, and they play no role in the stable patterns that govern the natural world. And there are other concepts that naturalists can appeal to, like Nelson Goodman's nomological circle, which is another contrafactual concept, but we don't need to get into that because the point isn't to explain what every naturalist can use as a foundational start for his naturalism, but that naturalists can have their own foundational starts. That doesn't jeopardize the distinction between natural and non-natural entities and powers. So no matter what metaphysical framework you use, naturalism would still reject supernatural entities like, the ancestor spirits, the astral intelligences, the demons, the devas, the fairies, the ghosts, the gods, the gremlins, the mermaids, the trolls, the vampires, the werewolves, the witches, the wizards, the yeti, the zombies, and the like, and also supernatural properties or forces like chi, karma, samsara, kami, sad, the Tao, and so forth. So the vocabulary may change, but the boundary between the natural and the non-natural remain the same. Alright, so next characterization of naturalism, what might have been. Now, this one is also about causal reality. For a naturalist, causal reality consists of none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. This is Oppy's account so far, but Oppy specifies that this account is about actual causal reality, not possible causal reality. This is another distinction that is important to make. The difference between actual reality and possible reality is that the former is about what is and the latter about what might have been. Oppy says that his account of naturalism simply tells us what we have right now in reality, but what if this reality that is actual, meaning the one that we have right now in front of us, what if this reality had the possibility to be something else? In actual reality, we can easily argue that indeed it consists of none but natural causal entities and powers, but if it was possible for this causal reality to consist of also non-natural entities and powers, wouldn't that mean that non-natural entities and powers exist as well, if not as actual being, then at least as possibilities? And so this means that non-natural entities and powers might have been with us, might have been, constituent of actual reality. So we are faced with this question. Could it have been the case that among the denizens of causal reality, there are non-natural causal entities and non-natural causal powers? So here too, many naturalists disagree. Some don't mind, the existence of non-natural causal entities and powers as long as we are talking about possible causal reality instead of the actual one. So they argue, well, it is true that there are no non-natural causal entities and powers now, like actual ones. There could have been. And according to Oppy, this requires a fairly loosely constrained view of what is possible, because indeed, if possibility for you means that there was a chance you could end up with non-natural entities and powers in our actual reality rather than just, other natural entities and powers than the ones that you have in actual reality, your conception of the possible isn't very constrained. For you, just because you can conceive of something, it means that that something is possible. Oppy puts it like this. Conceivability is a good guide to possibility. Like, this is what you would believe if you say that, yes, we could have ended up with non-natural entities. Okay, conceivability is a good guide to possibility. In short, if we can coherently conceive that P, then it is possible that P. Since you can coherently conceive of the entities and powers listed earlier figuring in causal reality, it is possible that those entities and powers figure in causal reality. So a way to justify this can be through the concept of recombination. The non-natural entities and powers that we listed, the werewolves, the spirits, the ghosts, the gods, the karma, the chakra, etc., they remain possible because they are just recombinations of parts of actual entities and powers. A dragon, for example, is just a recombination of bat wings, a snake, or salamander and fire. A unicorn, well, a recombination of a horse and a horn. As for their powers, well, you do the same but with physical forces, I guess. But the point is, as Oppy says, according to such naturalists, since we can plausibly suppose that the entities and powers listed earlier are recombinations of parts of actual entities and powers, it is possible that those entities and powers figure in causal reality. Now, of course, since this is all based on a fairly loose conception of the possible, like, this is taking way too much liberty with the notion of possibility. Naturalists who argue for the existence of non-natural stuff as possibility can take many different routes to justify such claim. For Oppy, this is obviously not convincing at all, and so he's one of the naturalists that argue that it is not merely that there actually are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers, but also that there could not possibly have been non-natural causal entities with non-natural causal powers. So this is the view he favors. Naturalism isn't that in actual reality there is none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. It is also that even in possible reality, even in the what might have been scenario, there are no non-natural entities and powers. In other words, non-natural entities and powers are simply impossible. They are non-existent even in possible causal reality. So, why does he believe this? Well, Oppy's view of naturalism here has three claims. He writes, first, there is shared history, which is necessarily any possible way for causal reality to be shares an initial history with the way that causal reality actually is. Second, there is actual naturalness. Actual causal reality is entirely natural. And three, there is a conservation of naturalness. Necessarily, if at some point causal reality is entirely natural, then it remains entirely natural at all subsequent points. These three claims entail that there could not possibly have been non-natural causal entities with non-natural causal powers. So, we have three claims: shared history, actual naturalness, and conservation of naturalness. If these three claims are true, then their conclusion must be true that there could not possibly have been non-natural causal entities and powers, and we have to see why. So let's take the second and third claim, the second and third claims, because they are, the least controversial. So actual naturalness and conservation of naturalness. So all naturalists are committed to these two claims, that actual causal reality is entirely natural, otherwise you aren't a naturalist if you claim that there are non-natural entities and powers in actual causal reality, and that by necessity, if at one point causal reality is entirely natural, then it will remain natural, it will always remain natural. Naturalists can disagree with the third claim, but that would be highly implausible. If now actual reality is entirely natural, but then in the future, that same actual reality becomes non-natural by having non-natural entities and powers among its denizens, then how could that happen? This means that from an entirely causal, actual, causal reality, meaning from a reality in which there are none but, an actual natural causal reality, from a reality that are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers, we got a non-natural causal reality. And so this would mean that natural causal powers caused non-natural causal powers, which is just an absurdity. So you cannot be a naturalist if you do not commit to both 2 and 3. Like Oppy says, after all, if you think that it is possible for non-natural causal entities with non-natural causal powers to arise in a possible causal reality in which hitherto there have been none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers, then what grounds do you have for being confident that no non-natural causal entities with non-natural causal powers will arise in actual causal reality? So, if you are confident that no non-natural causal entities with non-natural causal powers will rise in actual causal reality, that is the second claim, since actual causal reality is entirely natural, non-natural causal powers and entities cannot rise in it. But if you reject the third claim, then you have no ground for that confidence, even if you talk of just possible causal reality. Like, you can say that actual causal reality will never have non-natural features, but in possible reality you can. It's just that, the two realities will never intersect. Possible reality in which non-natural stuff can emerge from natural stuff will always remain just that, a possibility. But even that is wrong, because now you have taken so much liberty with the notion of possibility that it is just ridiculous. To conceive of a natural causal power giving rise to a non-natural entities or powers, even if you just confine it to the level of possible causal reality, then it still remains a contradiction. It is just impossible for natural entities and powers to cause non-natural entities and powers even in possible causal reality. The only way for you to try and save this mess is if you say that your possible reality, contrary to actual reality, isn't entirely natural. And the point is, for Oppy, if at any point your causal reality, whether actual or possible, is entirely natural, then everything that will follow from there has to be natural too. From natural, actual, or possible causal reality, only natural causal reality arises. So this also means that if you claim that possible reality isn't entirely natural, you also run in either having to contradict yourself by saying that the non-natural stuff causes and is caused by the natural stuff, or you have to just separate the two. The non-natural causes the non-natural, while the natural only causes the natural. So this is so implausible that it's better to just, commit fully to both claims. But this is where, we get to the first claim, which is shared history, the most controversial of the three, and that is related to this last point that we just said, having to separate the natural causal possible reality from the non-natural one. So those who claim that non-natural entities and powers exist in possible causal reality, they have to deny a shared history, meaning that causal reality and possible reality cannot share an initial history. They cannot have a common ancestor. Oppy says that they do have a common ancestor. They do have a shared history, since he doesn't believe in non-natural stuff, in even possible causal reality. So the shared history claim says that any possible way for causal reality to be shares an initial history with the way that causal reality actually is. So this means that all of those possible ways must start from the initial conditions as the actual world. In other words, you can imagine reality unfolding differently later, but you cannot imagine it having begun differently. So the initial history, the starting state of the universe, or the very early causal structure, is fixed across all possibilities. Differences can only appear after that initial stage. So by necessity, for a possible causal reality to be, it must share an initial history with actual reality. So this means that it is impossible for a possible reality with non-natural stuff to share an initial history with an actual reality that has none, or even a possible reality that has none. So those who believe in non-natural stuff in possible causal reality, meaning who suppose that conceivability is a good guide to possibility, or that any recombinations of part of actual entities and powers are possible entities and powers, they are forced to deny that, actual and possible reality share an initial history. So this, of course, doesn't mean that we cannot have possible reality. It's just that, we disagree on what we mean by possibility here. A more plausible view of possibility is to relate it to chance. Here, possibility means real, ontic, metaphysical possibility, and chance, real, ontic, metaphysical chance. Real, ontic, and metaphysical mean that the only kinds of possibility and chance that matter here are those that are genuinely features of the world itself, not features of our imagination, our theories, or our, ignorance. So the first term, real, serves to mark the distinction between mind-independent structures and merely conceptual ones. To say that possibility is real is to deny that it is a projection of our ignorance or an, artifact of some sort of, model just that helps us to understand reality, but, doesn't exist in reality. It is not something that is possible for all we know. It is something that the word itself affords, actually. In this sense, real possibility contrasts with purely epistemic possibility, possibility that depends on our limited knowledge rather than on the word's actual model structure. The second term, ontic, it pushes further in the same direction. Ontic possibilities are not just possibilities that we treat as real, they are possibilities grounded in the ontology of the world. It's actual inventory of entities, properties, powers, and laws. So to call a chance ontic is to locate it in the furniture of the word itself. Ontic chances are not just the subjective possibilities or probabilities with which we represent uncertainty, nor are they instrumental probabilities used to make predictions. They are instead ways that the word fundamentally can go given what it is. So a chance event is ontic if the word itself is indeterministic at that point. If a radioactive atom has a 50% chance of decaying in the next hour, the chance is literally a feature of the atom's physical and metaphysical constitution, not merely a reflection of our ignorance. And the third term, metaphysical, it marks the strongest layer. Metaphysical possibility concerns the structure of being, the conditions under which a word counts as a world. In this sense, to say that something is metaphysically possible is to say that it belongs to the absolute modal space of ways reality itself could unfold. When we speak of metaphysical chance, therefore, we are referring to chance as a fundamental feature of our model structure, not just a probabilistic pattern merely supervening on the actual laws. So in short, the three adjectives, they direct us towards a notion of possibility that is grounded not in imagination or conceptual freedom, but in the word's deepest mind-independent model structure. So this leads to another claim that doesn't contradict initial history, which is chance divergence. Necessarily, the only way that causal histories diverge is by having chances play out differently. So this is within the view that possible reality and actual reality share a common initial history, but they diverge. Possible reality and actual reality are both causal histories. In the case where they don't diverge, the possible and the actual are one and the same, meaning that here you have a strict deterministic view which excludes chance. In the case that they diverge, it doesn't mean that there are ways that actual reality might have been other than the way that it actually is. Things could have been differently, and if they are the way that they are, if we have the actual reality that we have, it's because chance is operative in causal reality. Chance divergence simply says that both histories diverge even though they share an initial history. It doesn't say that actual history can be something else than what it is. Okay? The claim there are ways that causal reality might have been other than the way that it actually is a claim that Oppy supposes with chance divergence to arrive at the conclusion that chance is operative in causal reality. That will be the fifth claim that Oppy will mention later on. So anyways, so here chance isn't random chaos, but simply the possibility that from the same initial history, from the same starting point, we could have had another outcome. So as Oppy says, with shared history and chance divergence, there are two sides to causal relations in causal reality. Some relations are deterministic, meaning that there is only one possibility for them to be, and they couldn't be otherwise given the cause. And one determined effect from one given cause, that's all you have. But other relations are indeterministic or probabilistic. A given cause has a range of possible effects, some with higher probability than others. So in determinism, the effect that results from a cause that was, actualized was the only possible effect, whereas in chance divergence, the actualized effect that resulted from the cause wasn't the only possible effect. So a cause can lead to different effects, but there is nothing that determines which of those effects is the one that, eventuates, as Oppy says. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, for example, argue that there are chance quantum events that cannot be predicted, not because we lack information, but because they are ontologically unpredictable. Nothing in the universe determines which outcome the event will take. Only the probability distribution is determined. Like, we can know or determine the different probabilities of the events, but not which event will certainly occur. So does this mean that these possible chance events are non-natural entities? What about, libertarian freedom, according to which, and this is again, according to some interpretations of libertarian freedom, there are chance-free actions of human beings. Do these free actions exist? Do we have, do we stop being a naturalist once we admit their existence? Do we have to rule them out? Well, this will obviously be premature. There is no reason why naturalists have to be strictly deterministic, since there is still so much we don't know about fundamental reality. As Oppy says, even if we suppose that quantum mechanics is deterministic and that nothing has libertarian freedom, it may still be that there is a fundamental level at which chance enters into causal reality. There is much that we do not yet know about causal reality. So there is no reason for us to reject probability in quantum mechanics, or even libertarian freedom for that matter, to be a naturalist. Probability, chance events, and free actions, they can be perfectly and consistently, considered natural entities with causal powers. But what about ordinary probabilistic talk? Does this, tolerance only apply to probability at the level of quantum mechanics? Are possible events real only when we talk about real ontic metaphysical chance only? What about, events at the level of classical physics? Are they always confined to follow deterministic rules? Can't we, assign probability to them too, etc.? Well, Oppy says not necessarily. Accepting shared history and chance divergence does not entail rejection of ordinary probabilistic talk. So he takes the following example. You roll a die that is not subject to real ontic metaphysical chance. If we follow the argument so far, then the result of the die is already determined. There is no probability if there is only one possible outcome, right? But Oppy says, so what? Sure, it would be absurd to try and calculate fair odds if we are going to bet on the roll of the die. Like, what is the point of trying to assign probabilities to a 4 or a 6 if there is only one really ontically metaphysical possible way for the roll to end? But the point is, we don't know what that outcome will be. We know that it is deterministic and only one possible outcome is in fact possible. So here our assumption that real ontic metaphysical chance is not in play. But we can still assign possibilities to the epistemically or doxastically possible outcomes of the roll. Meaning that, given that our knowledge is limited, given our lack of information, and therefore in this case our knowledge won't correspond to the ontological structure of the world, it is fair to act as if there are multiple possibilities with different degrees of probability, and if we can actually assign any degrees of probability. Like Oppy says, here we don't possess any information that favors one of the epistemically or doxastically possible outcomes of the roll over other epistemically or doxastically possible outcomes of the roll. Given our ignorance, we can do no better than to suppose that all of the epistemically or doxastically possible outcomes of the roll are equally likely. Of course, we could have evidence from previous rolls of the die that it is loaded towards particular outcomes, but let's suppose that we have no evidence that contradicts the claim that the die is fair. Moreover, even if we suppose that real ontic metaphysical chance is in play, or at any rate might be in play, when we roll the die, so long as we are ignorant of the chances, we can still do no better than to suppose that all of the epistemically or doxastically possible outcomes of the roll are equally likely. So it doesn't really matter if there is, a real ontic metaphysical chance or possibility in play here, because if there is, well, we have nothing better to do than suppose different outcomes with their different degrees of possibility, since these outcomes are within the ontological structure of the world. And if there isn't, and in reality there is only one possible outcome within the ontological structure of the world, our ignorance of that outcome makes it fair for us to assume that different possible outcomes are in fact possible and may have different degrees of possibility. Like he says, across a vast range of cases, we need to use epistemic or doxatic probabilities in order to accommodate our ignorance whether or not there are real ontic metaphysical chances in play. And in the case, where there are, he writes, if we know that real ontic metaphysical chances are in play, and we know what the real ontic metaphysical chances are, then our epistemic or doxastic probabilities should be key to those chances. So, just like I said, we key our probabilities to those real ontic metaphysical chances, to which we could add and specify that these probabilities and chances are natural. Again, admitting these chances doesn't mean that all of a sudden there is an infinity of outcome and so non-natural outcomes must get a probability too. So this is all within the claim of a shared history. So non-natural outcomes are ruled out. There is no probability that non-natural entities and powers might be or might have been, all right? But this is in the case where we know the chances in play, hence our ability to assign probability to them. But what if we don't know the chances in play? We know that, there is at least one chance, one possibility at least, but we don't know those chances. And so this works both for the case in which real ontic metaphysical chances and possibility exist, and in the case in which they don't exist, because in both cases, there's always at least one possibility. But when you don't know that one possibility or all the different outcomes, what do you do? Well, Oppy says, but when we do not know the real ontic metaphysical chances and nonetheless have need of epistemic or doxastic probabilities, we may be permitted to appeal to appropriately restricted version of conceivability and recombination and to other related principles in order to generate the epistemic or doxastic possibilities that populate the relevant probability space. So you can appeal to conceivability and recombination, which we kind of ruled out at first, but that's just in case you appeal to them to deny shared history and to appeal to them in order to argue that there are non-natural entities and powers. But if you appeal to them in appropriately restricted versions, then it's legit. So far, we have 3 claims: shared history, actual naturalness, conservation of naturalness, which are necessary for being a naturalist, and a 4th claim that depends on what you mean by shared history. Do you think that possible history and actual history diverge or not? If you think that they do, then you have the claim chance divergence. And now Oppy suggests that acceptance of these 4 claims with a chance divergence isn't enough to, quote, entail that there are chances and alternative ways that causal reality can be. Like, even chance divergence doesn't entail that, and we already specified this. We said that we need a 5th claim to say that there are chances and alternative ways that causal reality can be, and that 5th claim is the following principle: actual chance, actual causal reality is chancy. Now, chance divergence means that chance plays out in possibility, but that is just in possible causal reality. It doesn't mean that chance has a causal impact on actual reality, on actual causal reality, even if it is real ontic metaphysical chance. Like, chance can be some sort of a natural non-causal principle in actual causal reality that simply gives probabilities to different outcomes but doesn't participate in actual causal reality. Then actual causal reality can never be different from what it is. So you can also need to assert that there is actual chance, that actual causal reality is chancy. But none of this really matters, because at the end, no matter what stance you take, as long as you have the 3 first claims, you are a naturalist. Whether you want to add the other 2, whether you want to believe that actual causal reality and possible causal reality diverge, or that actual causal reality is chancy, it cannot lead you to justify that there are, or that there can be or could have been non-natural entities and powers. So as Oppy says, giving these 5 principles, while there are ways that causal reality could have been other than the way that it actually is, there are no ways that causal reality could have been in which there are non-natural causal entities with non-natural causal powers. Moreover, giving shared history, if actual causal reality has a finite history, then there is an initial part of causal reality that is necessary. Natural causal reality exists of necessity, as do any natural causal entities that belong to that initial part of causal reality. And he ends this section saying that there are other ways we can argue that there can be no non-natural entities and powers, but that will do for now. Alright, 4th characteristic now. After the conjuncture of ontological and methodological naturalism, the distinction between natural and the non-natural, and that there is no other way non-natural entities and powers could have been or might be, there is now the 4th characterization: big pictures. Now, so far, we didn't say anything about what naturalists consider fundamental, or what grounds all else, or what belongs to the base upon which all else supervenes. All we know for sure about naturalism is that it is the claim that there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. But that says nothing about what's fundamental, grounding, or subvenience. For a reminder, subvenience and supervenience are terms used to describe a specific kind of dependence relationship between sets of properties or facts. The distinction lies in which set is dependent on which. A set of properties A, for example, is said to supervene on a set of properties B if any change in A properties necessitates or necessarily requires a change in B properties. In other words, B properties determine A properties. You cannot have a difference in A without a corresponding difference in B. Subvenience is simply the inverse relationship. A set of properties B subvenes on a set of property B if B properties are determined by A properties. That is, A properties hold up B properties. Essentially, if A subvenes B, then B supervenes A. In Oppy's quote, the base upon which all else supervenes is the subvenience base. So naturalism, as defined, there are none but natural stuff, doesn't say anything about what to consider fundamental, grounding, or subvenience. Now, naturalists can disagree on those points, putting whatever kind of metaphysical commitment they wish, for long as they wish, so long as it doesn't entail non-natural stuff. Also, we've seen that the section about the distinction between natural and non-natural causal entities and powers didn't touch on the distinction between natural and non-natural properties. Given this, Oppy asks, should we suppose that these are reasons for thinking that our characterization of naturalism is adequate? If we didn't provide any claim about what is fundamental, and our distinction of natural and non-natural causal entities and powers didn't say anything about natural and non-natural properties, does it undermine our characterization of naturalism? Well, no. And this is where we need to say something about worldviews and big pictures. In the beginning of this chapter, we said that big pictures are worldviews, but we said that we'll just, consider them worldviews for now until we get, to their section. Now that we are here, we need to distinguish between big pictures and worldviews, because worldviews aren't really big pictures. Worldviews, first of all, are impossible. No one can have a worldview in the metaphysical and philosophical sense of the word. If you make a claim about the fundamental nature of reality, if you make a claim about what is grounding being or what subvenes beings, then you are making a claim about a worldview. You can say that you are doing first philosophy here. While naturalism doesn't prevent you from doing first philosophy, as long as that first philosophy doesn't contradict naturalism, naturalism itself doesn't entail a first philosophy or a specific one. You don't have to have a worldview or have a specific worldview in order to call yourself a naturalist. All worldviews are impossible to hold in the sense that you cannot fully justify them, and so it is unfair to force someone into holding a worldview in order to call themselves a naturalist or anything else. So here's how Oppy defines a worldview. A worldview is a theory of everything, a comprehensive, descriptive, evaluative, and normative account of reality. Even in principle, it is impossible for any of us to have a worldview. There are propositions that we lack the conceptual resources to formulate, and there are so many propositions that we do have the conceptual resource to formulate that even collectively we cannot entertain them all. So in short, given our limited knowledge and faculties, there are propositions that we cannot hold, either because we cannot formulate because we lack the conceptual resources, or because there are too many propositions for either one or the entire humanity to entertain, even if we have the conceptual resources. So on this account, if a worldview is a theory of everything, well, it is impossible to entertain. I mean, we can try to formulate a theory of what is fundamental and what subvenes everything, but we will always be probably wrong or cannot, justify it properly. That is why we need to settle for something less demanding than a worldview, and this is where big pictures come in. Oppy says, while we cannot have worldviews, we can have big pictures, theories that are the best approximations that we can make to worldviews. So, a big picture is an approximation of a worldview. It is the closest you can get to a worldview. They may not be able to answer all questions, but it's, as Oppy says, reasonable to expect that they would provide answers to the perennial big philosophical questions. So it means a big picture is an attempt to organize and make sense of reality in a coherent way, but it's not necessarily a perfect or fully finished worldview. You can think of it as a map. Not every tiny detail is included, but it shows the main roads and connections. A big picture doesn't have to be exhaustive, but it should be at least engage. It should at least engage with the core questions like what is reality, what is knowledge, what is the good life, what is morally right, etc. Even if it leaves some details open, a big picture gives substantial guidance on the central enduring questions of philosophy. Big pictures are then not necessarily formally perfect, meaning that they are not always optimally axiomatized, like a math theory, where every statement follows strictly from a small set of principles, but we can still expect them to strive for systematicity. They aim to have, general principles that unify many specific claims. And they also include lower-level detailed claims that principles. It's like, building a house. The general principles are the framework, the walls, the roof, and the lower level claims are the furniture, the plumbing, the decoration, etc. Both levels are part of the systematic whole. That being said, about naturalist big pictures, they can, as Oppy says, include carefully formulated claims about grounding and or fundamentality and or supervenience. They might spell out the claim that everything supervenes on the natural. So, fundamental reality is the natural. That's what grounds beings, and all beings simply are determined by the natural. They supervene on the natural while the natural subvenes them. So, this is a claim that can be spelled out in two relatively precise ways. A, there are no parts of minimal natural variance of actual causal reality that have no qualitative intrinsic natural properties. And B, there are no parts of minimal natural variance of actual causal reality that are exactly alike in all qualitative intrinsic natural properties, and yet that differ in some qualitative intrinsic properties. So the first point, A, is that there are absolutely no parts of actual causal reality that can have non-natural qualitative intrinsic properties. Qualitative intrinsic properties are properties that are independent of other things like mass, charge, and shape. They are properties that make a thing what it is by itself, not in relation to anything else, to another thing. So they are the most fundamental properties a thing can have. A naturalist who argues that everything supervenes on the natural claims that there are no possible variants of actual causal reality that would have, non-natural qualitative intrinsic properties. Everywhere, even in the smallest building blocks of actual causal reality, at the most fundamental level of reality, there would never be a thing that has qualitative intrinsic properties other than natural ones. So every part of minimal natural variant of reality must have only intrinsic natural properties. And as for B, that says that if two things at the most fundamental level of reality have the same natural intrinsic properties, there is no way they will have non-natural ones, nor one will have non-natural properties. In other words, if two entities share every intrinsic natural property, then they are identical in terms of their qualitative natural properties. No hidden differences are allowed. You cannot have two things that are exactly alike but secretly different in some qualitative aspect. Suppose that you have, two electrons that are identical in every intrinsic natural property, like in their mass, in their shape, in their spin, etc. Then according to B, there cannot be some subtle qualitative difference between them. They are indistinguishable in the relevant natural sense. You won't find that one has another different kind of property. And so in this sense, everything supervenes on the natural. And Oppy adds that among the naturalistic big pictures that include the claim that everything supervenes on the natural, some of them will also include the same claim with A and B, but with physical properties instead of natural properties. They would say that A, there are no part of minimal physical variance of actual causal reality that have no qualitative intrinsic physical properties, and B, there are no parts of minimal physical variance of actual causal reality that are exactly alike in all qualitative intrinsic physical properties and yet that differ in some qualitative intrinsic properties. So obviously, as Oppy points, this latter claim entails the former, that everything supervenes on the natural, since all physical reality is natural reality. If it is physical, then it is natural. So the consequence is that a naturalistic big picture is predicated on that former claim that everything supervenes on the natural. So to hold such a claim is a requirement for naturalistic big pictures. But that claim, everything supervenes on the natural, doesn't have to be taken as primitive or fundamental. Like naturalistic big pictures don't have to take that claim as primitive or fundamental for them to be naturalistic big pictures. So if someone asks you, do you take the claim that everything supervenes on the natural as a fundamental claim, and you say no, they cannot say, well, then you're not a naturalist, because then you will be confusing a big picture with a worldview. Unless we both agree that fundamental can be fundamental but in a loose sense, this would be a better way to distinguish between a worldview and a big picture. It's not that a big picture doesn't have a fundamental basis, it's just a matter of how loose that basis can be. A worldview, for example, demands that such a basis be beyond any doubt, that we don't just suppose it, but we take it as true with utmost certainty. In short, would be, asking for an informative explanation. However, as we said earlier about, informative explanations, demanding, such explanation cannot be reasonable. Every fundamental claim is bound to be controversial, meaning that people can reasonably object to it. And so this happens even among naturalists. Like Oppy says, while it might seem reasonable to suppose that naturalists will agree that there is some loose sense in which reality is fundamentally natural, or in which everything is grounded in the natural, or in which everything supervenes upon the natural, there is no reason to expect that naturalists will agree on any very precise formulation of these claims. So this doesn't mean that we don't have to provide further formulation and arguments in favor of fundamental principles, or we can do away with first philosophy. This isn't an excuse to avoid doing hard inquiry. It simply says that when it comes to philosophy, or to first philosophy, we shouldn't take controversy as a sign that we didn't try hard enough, and as if, there will be a moment in which we can all agree about the most fundamental metaphysical stances if only we continue our investigation. Oppy is like, we continue our investigation of what is fundamental and grounding and all, but don't expect us to reach absolute consensus or agreement about these matters. These will always be controversial. There will always be, some gray areas, and therefore philosophical investigation is always a work in progress. Okay, he says, It is a familiar feature of philosophical investigation that increasing precision in formulation does not necessarily lead to increasing convergence of opinion. Our big pictures are always works in progress. In particular, the precise formulations of the commitments of our big pictures are always works in progress. So this is another way to frame the difference between a worldview and a big picture. A worldview supposes that one has already reached truth about the fundamental nature of reality, and therefore no further philosophical investigation is required. On the other hand, a big picture, it recognizes that further investigation and precision in formulation has no end. And it doesn't, suppose that it will lead to agreement, convergence of opinion about fundamental claims about reality, So it argues that precise formulations of the commitments of our big pictures are always works in progress, and that is precisely why we need to continue investigating, to always continue investigating. Now let's go back to the two principles stated above about natural and physical properties. The first one makes use of a distinction between natural and non-natural properties, and the second between physical and non-physical properties, obviously. And Oppy argues that philosophers might try to overanalyze or quibble about the exact difference between natural/non-natural and physical/non-physical properties, but he suggests not to worry too much. We simply apply to them what we said in the section natural and non-natural, natural and non-natural. Remember that Oppy said that these distinctions are common, they are pre-theoretical, and yet they work perfectly fine for the purpose at hand. And further theorizing on these distinctions is more likely to secure less agreement than is typically found in their pre-theoretical application. So that's all for big pictures. We can then now move to attitudes, the fifth characterization of naturalism, or in this case, the lack thereof. So far, we've just defined naturalism. We said that. We have said that naturalists are those who have naturalistic big pictures, and that naturalistic big pictures are those that include or entail naturalism. Further, we have said that naturalism is the view that A, science is our touchstone for identifying the denizens of causal reality, and B, there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. Moreover, we have noted that it is controversial among naturalists whether, though I myself accept that, there must be none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. And finally, we have noted that while naturalists are typically committed to some version of the claim that reality is fundamentally natural, it is controversial among naturalists how this claim might properly be made more precise. So this is everything that we've seen so far, and this is as good as a definition of naturalism can get. But this doesn't include or doesn't say anything about the attitudes that naturalists are supposed to have towards these characterizations of naturalism. For example, should naturalists believe in naturalism in an all or nothing matter? Is belief, an all or nothing matter? If it is, then naturalists must be committed to the propositions that define naturalism, but it doesn't say anything about what kind of believing attitude naturalists might have towards those propositions. Oppy mentions the notion of the web of belief, which is a notion by the analytic philosopher Quine. The web of belief means that our beliefs form a network. They are not isolated atoms, okay? You have central beliefs, which are deeply embedded, connected to many other beliefs, and they are difficult to revise. And then you have peripheral beliefs, which are loosely connected and can be changed more easily. Think of it like a spider web, okay? If you touch the center, the whole web shakes. But if you touch the edges, only a few threads move. And so the question becomes, where do naturalistic beliefs have to figure in the web of belief in order for you to be called a naturalist? Must they be, in the center and therefore relative immune to revision? Should naturalists hold their beliefs unreservedly? Meaning, to be a naturalist, you must hold, naturalistic beliefs fully, without hesitation, without doubt or conditionality. Like you accept the belief completely and wholeheartedly. Like, you do not keep mental backup plans in case your belief, turns out to be false. You do not suspend judgment or treat the belief as merely probable, but always straightforwardly true, not as something that you are only exploring or entertaining without reservation, without maybe, and without intellectual hedging. Or should they hold, their beliefs rather tentatively or provisionally? So this is the opposite of unreservedly. Okay, it means in a hesitant, provisional, or unsure way. If you believe something tentatively, then it is relatively exposed to revision, located somewhere near the periphery of the web of belief. So you are saying, I think this might be true, but I'm not fully committed. I accept it for now, but I'm open to revision. This is just a working assumption. So should naturalists believe with some intermediate degree of conviction? Are they, still a naturalist if they are more open to revision, like, changing them would not disrupt too much of the rest of their belief system? Or does your belief have to be, well supported? Do you require other beliefs to strongly support your naturalistic beliefs? Does it have to be associated with a panoply of strong supporting reasons? Do they have to be backed by many strong reasons? Or is it okay to be a naturalist if your beliefs are only weakly supported by other beliefs associated with few weak supporting reasons? Now, this doesn't mean that central beliefs cannot be revised. Quine insists that all beliefs are never fully immune to revision, but some are more immune than others. And also strongly supported strongly supported beliefs don't mean that they are central in the web of life. Centrality is about, connectedness in the web, while support is about, the reasons that you have for holding the beliefs. So these are all all or nothing attitudes towards beliefs, but there are also other attitudes towards belief. There's the idea that beliefs are really point credences or interval credences. So point credences means a numerical degree of belief, like I believe this with credence 0.7, like 70%. If belief is defined this way, then a naturalist must assign credence greater than 0.5, like it's more likely than not to be a naturalist. Okay, they must assign a credence greater than 0.5 to the conjunction of the two propositions that define naturalism, meaning ontological and methodological naturalism. In other words, to count as a naturalist, you must think it is more probable than not that both claims that define naturalism are true. So X believes in P if X assigns to P credence greater than 0.5. Then you have interval credences. Here you consider range as a degree of belief, like my credence is between 0.6 and 0.8. If belief is defined in terms of ranges, then a naturalist must, assign an interval whose lower bound is greater than 0.5 to the conjunction. Even the lowest value of the naturalist degree of belief must indicate more likely than not. So the same point applies to different and more complex accounts of belief, like, imprecise credences or sets of probabilities. Naturalists must treat the defining propositions as more probably true than false on whatever, cradle model you use. But to take beliefs as credences, whether point or interval, it leaves open other questions about the believing attitudes that naturalists might take towards naturalists' propositions. The all or nothing attitude, at least they try to tell us something about the resilience and robustness of our beliefs. But if beliefs are just credences, well, the credence view doesn't say anything about the resilience or the robustness of those credences. All we may know from this is how probable the naturalist thinks naturalism is. But knowing how probable someone judges naturalism to be does not tell us how stable or resilient that belief is. I mean, of course, a naturalist thinks that naturalism is more probable, but that doesn't tell me that his reasons for thinking that are strong or weak, or even where it is located in his web of belief. Someone can have a high credence towards naturalism and thinks that it is very probable, but has very low resilience, meaning that a small piece of contrary evidence would sharply reduce your credences. And likewise, someone can have a moderate credence but very high resilience, meaning that your belief is stable, firmly anchored, and won't change easily. So as Oppy says, no matter what credences are held concerning the propositions that define naturalism, those credences may be only very weakly robust or resilient, or they may be very strongly robust or resilient. So these are the attitudes that naturalism have towards their beliefs. Now, is there anything in naturalism that compels us into adopting any of these attitudes? Well, no. Naturalism as a big picture doesn't tell you that you have to hold naturalism as an all or nothing belief or as credences in order to be a naturalist. It doesn't require that you are capable of providing the best justification or reasons for it, or that you must wholeheartedly commit to the belief in order to be considered a naturalist. That being said, this also entails that naturalism has to be regarded as just a belief like any other belief. So we should naturally expect that there would be naturalists that hold the belief that are characteristic of naturalism dogmatically or irrationally or unreasonably, or on the basis of middling to weak reasons and so forth. So these are naturalists, even if they are dogmatic, irrational, or unreasonable, or base their naturalism on weak reasons. I wouldn't, for example, say that X isn't a naturalist because his reasons that support his naturalism are weak, or because he is dogmatically committed to naturalism. So any attitude that naturalists may have towards their naturalistic belief, they don't follow from naturalism itself. There isn't a single element in the characterization of naturalism, as the claim that science is our touchstone for identifying the denizens of causal reality, and the claim that there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers, which entails a certain attitude towards that conjuncture of claims. So this doesn't mean that naturalists don't have attitudes towards naturalism, or even towards people who don't have naturalistic beliefs. Oppy simply says that it is possible for naturalistic beliefs to be held dogmatically, stressing the possible, which means that such attitudes aren't, an inherent feature of naturalism. But he also says that we need to acknowledge that possibility, and that we should, emphasis on the should, acknowledge the equally obvious point that there are dogmatic naturalists. That we need and that we should suggest attitudes towards the attitudes of naturalists towards naturalism. So even Oppy has attitudes towards his naturalism, like proper doxastic humility, but those attitudes, they don't come from naturalism itself. And all of it actually depends on what you want to do with naturalism. What concerns Oppy, for example, is just to be able to draw general conclusions about naturalistic big pictures, and this of course requires a certain attitude from him towards those naturalistic big pictures, but for his purpose, what he needs to do is to focus our attention on best naturalistic big pictures. So of course he's going to discriminate among naturalistic big pictures, he's going to make judgments about them, arguing that some big pictures are better than others, even among naturalistic big pictures. However, focusing on best naturalistic big pictures by characterizing the less than best ones doesn't, mean that naturalism by criticizing the less than best ones. It doesn't mean that naturalism doesn't have intellectual virtues, just like, the attitudes held towards naturalistic beliefs don't say anything about naturalism itself. That a naturalist is dogmatically naturalist doesn't mean that naturalism is itself dogmatic and requires that naturalists believe dogmatically in naturalism, or that naturalism doesn't have intellectual virtues, like it lacks coherence or explanatory power, etc. So this applies to both less than best naturalistic big pictures and best extant naturalistic big pictures, the best ones that we have right now. Any extant naturalistic big pictures are susceptible of improvement. So all big pictures will exhibit shortcomings and suffer, from various deficits. This doesn't mean that we have to abandon naturalism, since this doesn't tell us anything about naturalism's virtues. And so the same also applies to non-natural big pictures that are in competition with naturalistic big pictures. Just as we shouldn't judge naturalism based on imperfect examples, we shouldn't also judge non-naturalistic views based on flawed versions. So just as we must, focus on the best naturalistic big pictures rather than flawed ones, the same goes for non-naturalistic worldviews, because, all big pictures are works in progress, like we said. They can be improved, and no one has perfect knowledge. No one has intellectual certainty, so we must all exhibit some sort of intellectual humility, which is, the proper doxastic humility, which requires that one only makes tentative, provisional comparisons between them. And so that would be the appropriate attitude. Being doxastically humble means acknowledging the limits of your knowledge and being careful about how confidently you make claims. But these attitudes towards naturalism and also towards non-naturalism, they are not characteristics of naturalism itself. Okay, so we now get to the sixth section, which is about some critics. We have defined naturalism as precisely as possible, Now let's see what the critics often say. Oppy will focus on the book edited by William Lane Craig and James Porter Moreland, Naturalism, A Critical Analysis, published in the year 2000. It's a compilation of collected 10 essays by different scholars, theologians, and philosophers, all attacking naturalism, attempting to show that it cannot give an adequate account of knowledge, intentionality, properties, ordinary objects, minds, free agent, morality, the origins of the universe, the origins of life, among other things. So that is what the different contributions to the volume try to show, that naturalism cannot give an adequate account of those things, and also that naturalism with certain commitments, it comes with certain commitments that are unacceptable. So these aren't just theoretical commitments, like naturalism forces us to commit to some absurd theoretical views about the natural of the world, but even normative commitments as well. If we were truly committed to naturalism, then we cannot be moral human beings, or let's just say that nothing would compel us to act morally. For example, Oppy doesn't mention this one from the list of quotes from the volume he gives just below. Like these concern primarily the theoretical commitments, but there's an example from John E. Hare, one of the contributors of the volume, from his essay Naturalism and Morality. So he says, for example, that any attempt to reconcile naturalism with morality is inconsistent, since according to Hare, morality's source is divine assistance. He takes inspiration from Kant, but it's the classical case of naturalism cannot give us moral commitments, and therefore anyone who is a naturalist denies morality. So to be committed to naturalism means that you cannot act morally, but since most naturalists act morally, then they are contradicting their own naturalist beliefs. And so, naturalism would be self-defeating. He says this at the end of the essay, like I'm just going to read from it, like I have it right here. So he says, what is the implication of all this for the relation between naturalism and morality? We can put this both negatively and positively. Negatively, the point is that there is an incoherence involved in accepting both naturalism and the moral gap picture of morality. And positively, the point is that we need moral faith if we are to sustain moral lives through the experience of evil. If naturalists have a way to give us such moral faith, they need to present it to us. So obviously, he presupposes that he rhetorically, I mean, that's a rhetoric question. Like, can naturalists give us, a way to have, moral faith? The answer is no for Hare. But obviously, this claim is false, and there is nothing in naturalism that excludes morality or that would make, morality, incoherent with naturalism. I mean, Oppy himself is a moral realist, someone who believes that there are moral facts, and we will come back to that in the last chapter, where Oppy mentions an essay of his which addresses morality from a naturalist perspective. So here he chose quotes that are more about naturalism's characteristics regarding its conjuncture of ontological and methodological naturalism, and as Oppy said, these characterizations that the critics give naturalism are themselves not accepted by naturalists. So let's take a look. For example, from Paul Moser and David Yendel's Farewell to Philosophical Naturalism, he quotes, "Every legitimate method of acquiring knowledge consists of or is grounded in the hypothetically completed methods of the empirical sciences, that is, in natural methods." From Dallas Willard's Knowledge and Naturalism, he quotes, "All knowledge is reducible to, or in some manner, continuous with sense perception." From Robert C. Kuhn's, not sure how to pronounce their names, by the way, because many of them that I don't know, like I just discovered while reading the book, Naturalism and the Critical Analysis. From Robert C. Kuhn's, I'm going to say, The Incompatibility of Naturalism and Scientific Realism, he quotes, "Human knowledge and intentionality are to be explained entirely in terms of scientifically understandable causal connections between brain states and the world." From Moreland's Naturalism and the Ontological Status of Properties, he quotes, "The only explanations that count are scientific explanations." From Michael C. Ria's Naturalism and Material Objects, he quotes, "The naturalistic program consists primarily of a plan to use the methods of the natural sciences and those methods alone in the development of philosophical theories." We will come back to Rea in the chapter. In the chapter Does Religion Defeat Naturalism? Specifically, on his notion of program, of research program more specifically. Then from Stuart Gutz's Naturalism and Libertarian Agency, he quotes, "The fundamental explanation of any event is non-psychological in nature." And from William Dembski's Naturalism and Design, he quotes, "Scientific naturalism would have us understand the universe entirely in terms of the undirected causes studied by science. In particular, since human beings are a part of the universe, who we are and what we do must ultimately be understood in these terms." So these are... there are also, other essays not quoted here besides Hare's. There's also Naturalism and the Mind by Charles Taliaferro and Naturalism and Cosmology by William Lane Craig. But you will find similar statements about naturalism's characterization in those essays as well. Now, in the section about attitudes, we said that it is important that we exhibit some doxastic humility, and if we are going to talk about the big picture, we should not strawman it by picking up the weakest or worst versions of it as if they are representative of the big picture as a whole. So you don't disprove naturalism by simply criticizing the weakest versions of naturalism or naturalist-based pictures, But that is precisely what the contributors in Craig and Moreland's volume do. It's true that there are naturalists who accept the characterizations given in these quotes, just like there are dogmatic, irrational, and unreasonable naturalists. So yes, there are some naturalists, and even very famous ones, who accept these characterizations, but there are also many who don't. And this is something that we've already established in the first section, first pass. For example, the quotes above center on naturalism's epistemology. According to these critics, when naturalists say that science is our touchstone for identifying natural causal entities and powers, they hear that knowledge about reality can only be obtained through the natural sciences and the scientific method, by which they also reduce, to empirical science, meaning to sense data. That's explicitly expressed in Moser and Yandel and also Willard, for example. So naturalists are basically empiricists, according to these critics, and they just believe what they can see or what they perceive through their senses only. But we have already established that these claims are not inherent characterizations of naturalism. Supposing that there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers, and that science is our touchstone for identifying them, it doesn't prevent you from accepting, for example, that the humanities have genuine methods of inquiring knowledge. Reading fiction isn't grounded in the hypothetically completed methods of the empirical sciences, for example, but you can have genuine knowledge from reading novels or plays or watching movies, etc. This doesn't undermine naturalism at all. Also, naturalism doesn't deny that philosophy yields knowledge. Philosophy, for example, has important things to teach about logic and reasoning, and those things that knowledge isn't reducible to just sense perception. Even naturalists don't have to only appeal to empirical sciences about our brains to give accounts on logic and reasoning or epistemology or even consciousness. Kuhn's assertion that, according to naturalists, knowledge of our conscious states is explained in terms of scientifically understandable causal connections between brain states and the world is false. Not all naturalists make that claim, and naturalism itself doesn't. There are naturalists who accept that characterization, but if they want to make it an essential characterization of naturalism, meaning you can only be a naturalist if you accept that characterization, their argument and justification for it will be very likely fallacious. Normative and evaluative explanations like morality or aesthetic judgments, when you say, this is good or this painting is beautiful because this or that, these aren't necessarily scientific explanations, and it doesn't bother naturalists. Naturalism didn't come crashing down because we know that normative and evaluative explanations aren't scientific explanations. It doesn't also mean that those explanations aren't real explanations, like we have to make them to be wrong explanations. And accepting that those non-scientific explanations are valid doesn't mean that you suddenly have to accept that there are non-natural entities and powers. Just because we have explanations of morality and aesthetics doesn't rely or make use of natural scientific methods. It doesn't mean that those explanations are wrong or unreliable, like it's not true or real knowledge to give an account on what is ethical or beautiful, what we should consider moral or beautiful. And admitting that you can have real knowledge on subjects without making use of any natural scientific method, it doesn't mean that naturalism is false, because it never claimed that all explanations, even normative and evaluative ones, must be scientific, otherwise it is worthless. Again, as Oppy says, philosophers may legitimately develop philosophical theories about normative and evaluative domains without making use of any natural scientific methods, and we are perfectly fine with that. Almost all theories of ethics don't use natural scientific methods, and everyone is cool with that. Against Goethe's assertion that, according to naturalists, fundamental explanation of any event is non-psychological in nature, Oppy simply says that, many naturalists accept that fundamental psychological explanation is psychological in nature. This is in relation to free will and agency, for example. Götz claims that since naturalism reduces everything to natural elements, by which he thinks they mean physical events, then whatever characterizes your mental states has to be reduced to those physical events. So to explain someone's psychology, I just explain it through chemical neurological processes. Why did X do Y? Because his neurons were firing out whatever substance in his brain. And that again is wrong, as we've seen. Saying that there are none but natural causal entities and powers doesn't mean that you have to reduce everything to those entities and powers and providing an explanation or account for it. We've seen this possibility with the example of emergence theory. Emergence theory doesn't undermine naturalism. We can explain psychological states without reducing them to the physical stuff from which they emerge. But that doesn't mean that we have to give psychological states some sort of non-natural properties. We don't have to get, souls involved in this. And so the same applies to the notion of human virtue. Here too, like, normative and evaluative and psychological explanations, the ultimate understanding of human virtue doesn't have to be cast solely in terms of empirical data or formulated according to the scientific method. As a matter of fact, Oppy affirms that it is not cast solely in terms of the causes studied by science. So he recognizes that. Naturalism never said that every explanation, for it to be, a genuine and legit explanation, has to be cast solely in terms of the causes studied by science. But admitting that doesn't undermine naturalism. Sure, some can find it unsettling and unsatisfying, but again, naturalism isn't a worldview but a big picture. It isn't as ambitious as wanting to provide a theory for everything. Big pictures, like we said, are works in progress, whether they are naturalistic or non-naturalistic. And like all big pictures, they are subject to strawman attacks. Naturalists can do the same thing with non-naturalist big pictures, of course, as demonstrated by many new atheists. What's the implication for this? Well, the first implication is that while it is true that the critics in this volume make mostly strawman attacks, it doesn't mean that all objections to naturalism are strawman attacks. Since a big picture is by definition a work of progress, then there has to be genuine objections to it, right? So of course there are objections to it, or more precisely to current formulations to naturalism. As we've seen, naturalists among themselves make constant refutations of other naturalists' formulations. The second implication is that we cannot also say that the same attacks in Gregg and Moreland's volumes are entirely strawman attacks either. The contributors of the volumes do rely on naturalist claims. To quote Oppy again, there certainly have been naturalists, sometimes very prominent naturalists, who have advanced some of the claims that these critics take to be canonical for naturalists. But that doesn't mean that you can reject the family of big pictures, like the big picture that is, naturalism, but only various formulations of big pictures. Like he says, if you don't throw away the whole family just because some of its members are badly behaved. All families of big pictures have badly behaved members. So yes, there are badly behaved naturalists who take, for example, scientism as a canonical characterization of naturalism, but they are just wrong. So here we need to address a methodological point, since objecting to big pictures can only be done on the grounds of members, not the whole family. We need to move with precautions here. What the critics in Craig and Moreland tried to show is that the family of naturalistic big pictures are self-defeating, internally inconsistent with uncontroversial data, etc. And this is, however, impossible to show, given that there is a large family of naturalistic big pictures and given that these naturalistic big pictures differ considerably from one another. And the same thing applies to non-naturalistic big pictures. You cannot show that the large family of non-naturalistic big pictures are self-defeating as well. All you can do is engage in a comparative approach within each family, so between the members themselves and between members of the different families. You take the family of naturalistic big pictures and you compare the members. You think about the comparative merits of naturalistic big pictures. You see which picture is best, which one is better than another based on its theoretical virtues, and we will explain what that is as we go through the book, because Oppy is going to apply that same comparative approach between naturalistic and non-naturalistic big pictures to see which has more virtues, than the other. And so this is all we can do. You can compare members either within the same family or between families. When, for example, we compare naturalistic big pictures with theistic big pictures, does it turn out that we can be fairly confident that the best big picture belongs to just one of these two families? When we compare naturalistic big pictures with all of the other families of big pictures, does it turn out that we can be fairly confident that the best big pictures belong to just one of those families? So this is what we will try to do in the next chapters. We will try to answer the question which family of big pictures has the best big pictures when we compare all of them. So this is the method that Oppy will use to assess the merits of naturalistic and theistic big pictures, since it is mostly theistic big pictures now that interest us here rather than any non-naturalist big pictures. So he says, given that it is implausible to suppose that it can be shown that all naturalistic big pictures are self-defeating, and given that we wish to assess the comparative merits of naturalistic big pictures, what we should be doing is setting particular naturalistic big pictures against competing big pictures and assessing the comparative merits of these big pictures. So Craig and Moreland's volume failed to precisely do that. They are unsatisfactory for two reasons, or because they fail to do two things. They don't, A, give detailed articulations of the competing big pictures that make clear the commitments of those competing big pictures, and they don't, B, engage in detailed comparison on particular points of data of the explanations that the competing big pictures offer of that data. The approach taken in Craig and Moreland leaves it entirely open for readers to conclude that naturalistic big pictures are the very worst big pictures, except for all of the other big pictures. So, the critics in Craig and Moreland, they don't do those two things. Good criticism is that you first give detailed articulation of the big pictures that are competing, which the critics fail to do. Their articulations of naturalistic big pictures are loaded with claims that naturalists don't accept, and therefore they misrepresent naturalism, and even mislead readers about the commitments of those big pictures. For example, in the first essay by Moser and Yandel, on the very first page, they say that if you are a naturalist, then you have to be committed to a rejection of first philosophy, which he justifies by mistaking naturalism for scientism. And of course, they don't compare the explanations of the competing big pictures regarding data. They don't, for example, say, here's how theistic big pictures and naturalistic big pictures provide explanation for data, even for non-empirical data. They just take it for granted that naturalism cannot explain non-empirical data, since they have, from the start, defined naturalism as confined to only empirical data. So, of course, when you criticize this view, when what you present to your readers are strawmen, you're going to convince them that naturalistic big pictures are the worst big pictures. But you won't convince them that the ones you didn't mention, which happen to be stronger claims of naturalism, lost this miserably when competing with theistic big pictures. Alright then, so now we can conclude this first chapter. What is naturalism? So this last section is just going through what we saw in each section. We started with giving a rough characterization of naturalism. We said that it is best characterized by the conjunction of ontological and methodological naturalism. So we have two claims that make naturalism, and we can formulate them in two different ways. We can say that, number one, natural reality exhausts causal reality. So that's ontological naturalism. And two, scientific method is the touchstone for identifying the denizens of causal reality, which is methodological naturalism. And more carefully, first, there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. And second, scientific method is the touchstone for identifying natural causal entities and natural causal powers. Still in the first section, first pass, We also try to say what isn't naturalism. Now, this doesn't mean that naturalism is against the following notions, but that these notions don't follow necessarily from naturalism, and hence you will find that naturalists have different attitudes towards them. This means that being a naturalist doesn't mean that you are a nominalist, an empiricist, a physicalist, a materialist, a scienticist, a mental or modal eliminativist, or that you reject first philosophy or a space-time fundamentalist. Sure, you can be a naturalist and any of those things, but naturalism doesn't compel you into any of these labels by itself. So, for a reminder, nominalism is the view that abstract entities like numbers, universals, or properties do not exist independently of particular things and our way of speaking about them. Empiricism, that's the epistemological position that all genuine knowledge of the world ultimately depends on experience, on observation, or sensory input. Physicalism, the metaphysical thesis that everything that exists is ultimately physical. Materialism, everything that exists is made of matter or material stuff. It's often used interchangeably with physicalism, though sometimes more restrictively. Scientism, the epistemic stance that only science or the methods of the natural sciences yield genuine knowledge or authoritative explanations. And mental eliminativism, so that's the claim that common sense mental states like beliefs, desires, and intentions do not actually exist and will be eliminated by a mature cognitive science. And modal eliminativism is the position that modal notions, possibility, necessity, contrafactuals, are not real features of the world and should be removed from serious metaphysical or scientific explanations. Then you have rejection of first philosophy. It means that there is no fundamental, a priori philosophical discipline prior to science. Inquiry just starts within science, not above or before it. And fundamentality of space-time means the view that space-time is a basic, irreducible feature of reality, not emergent from more fundamental ontological structures. So in the second section, natural and non-natural, we went through a few controversies regarding the distinction between the natural and the non-natural, that naturalists do not agree on whether it is necessarily true that there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers, and naturalists do not agree on whether it is necessarily true that scientific method is the touchstone for identifying natural causal entities and natural causal powers. In the third section, what might have been, and the fourth section, big pictures, we've seen that naturalists do not agree about what is fundamental or about what grounds all else, or about what belongs to the base on which all else supervenes. Because of that, it is important to leave open such questions and see that big pictures are always works in progress rather than definite answers, theories of everything, or simply worldviews. And the fifth section, attitudes, was about what attitudes naturalists have towards naturalism, and we've seen that naturalism, well, doesn't in itself entail any specific attitude to have towards naturalism. But giving the view that naturalism is a big picture, we can argue that a doxastic, humble attitude would be more compatible with naturalism than dogmatism. So naturalism differ in the nature, naturalists differ in the nature, strength, and resilience of their commitments to naturalism. Most naturalists are fallibilists. Few naturalists are dogmatists. So a fallibilist, that's how it is pronounced, I think, fallibilist, is someone who holds that all of our beliefs, including our best supported scientific, philosophical, or everyday beliefs, could in principle be mistaken. So no belief is absolutely certain or infallible. So that's the doxastic humility. All beliefs are not, there isn't a belief that is immune to revision, if you want. And the last section, which is the critics, it was about how much contemporary criticism of naturalism misses the mark, because often it works with characterizations of naturalism that fail to capture what many and often enough most contemporary naturalists believe. So this is also about the methodology of criticism. When doing a criticism, you should be able to make a very important distinction between the contents of particular naturalistic big pictures and the claims that are common to all naturalistic big pictures. In other words, what is an intrinsic characterization of naturalism and what isn't. All right, so that is the chapter, What is Naturalism? Next week we are going to start the chapter, we're going to read the next chapter, What is Religion? So that's going to be very interesting. It's a very, passionate chapter. And that's it. Thank you for watching. I will see you next week, and please